Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be responding to a content creator that I've wanted to for a while. We have always existed transgender history. And I kept telling them, I want to watch your stuff. I want to respond to it. But then I had to move. I had to get settled and various other things. And then after that, it just seemed hard to find the time. Well, now I found the time and I would like to give one of their videos a look and give my thoughts on it. And I want to try a technique where I watch the video along with it. I watch along with the video and I give my thoughts as I'm watching it. I'll have the video itself with the volume turned down somewhat, and then from there I can just kind of comment as I watch. And this is kind of an experiment because this is a video essay, but I will have the closed captions on, and it should help keep the video relatively short. My response to We Have Always Existed's video, that is. So yeah, without further ado, I really, really like their stuff, and they are more of a historiographer. They study history and the study of history, and I'm more of a literary analyst that incorporates some historical elements, but I'm more concerned with the performance of things in a Gothic way, the Gothic being classically ahistorical. That's not to say that there aren't historical components, but they're generally played with in ways not dissimilar to fascists, but fascists do it in service to the state, whereas I'm an anarcho-communist. So I'm going to be taking that in with me as I'm watching this and just giving food for thought as we watch along. Lastly, before we start, two more things to keep in mind. One, I'm going to be watching this video from start to finish, but please go and support We Have Always Existed. They make wonderful content, and they offer a lot of really unique historical perspectives that I find really valuable. And I think that they well deserve any compensation for the work that they can get. I'm responding to their work and giving my thoughts and feedback, but please go and watch their video in its entirety and give them, like, share, and subscribe to their stuff. They have a Patreon, I believe. And yeah, they are awesome. Go support them. If you want to support me as well, like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment. I also have a Patreon and various other links that I'll provide as well. Apart from that, as I watch the video from start to finish, the video volume is going to be kind of low, just to guarantee that you can hear me over their video. Basically, they're going to be a bit quieter and harder to hear. I will have subtitles, but at the end of the day, the best way to guarantee that you can hear what they're saying is to just go and watch their video. This video, you're watching me responding to them, so I have to make sure that you can hear me, and you'll at the very least be able to read the subtitles. All right, without further ado, let's get started.
Historically, the movement toward androgyny.
I haven't seen this video, so I'm assuming that this is some kind of right-winger. That's a cool TV, by the way.
Who live in such periods, a late phase of culture, whether it's the Hellenistic era,
The argument that there's this late phase, civilization enters decay, and there must be some kind of scapegoat, which is Weimar Germany, the horrors of Weimar, trans people, Magnus Hirschfeld. So that's a period that I've studied regarding sex work as something to defend from fascism, infatuation with the transgender person, and the downfall of civilization. Correlation doesn't equal causality, but tell that to fascists, right? I love that. That painting is quite famous too, The Fall of Rome. It's one I've referenced
Such a
myself.
ridiculous idea. Every once in a while, some very smart and clever and unique and very interesting boy shows up in the comments and tells me this is why Rome fell, or something like that.
Ah,
The best
yes.
part of it is that they're usually commenting on the Galli, the priestesses of
That's
Italy,
something I
which
hear
I've
quite a
argued
bit
before,
myself.
can reasonably be interpreted through a transgender historical lens. They first appeared in Rome in 205 BCE. The Roman historian Titus Livius, or just Livy, tells us that. At that point, the Roman state was just a bit bigger than the modern Republic of Italy. They were in the midst of the Second Punic War against Carthage and had just acquired
So this is
several
the
territories outside the Italian peninsula. Of course, Rome defeated Carthage, and in
historiography
fact, the Romans themselves
lens
attributed their victory, at
that
least in part,
is
to
being
the
offered
presence of
by
Puli
Sophie.
and gala attendants. So it's not only silly to say trans people caused the fall of Rome, it would be more accurate to say trans people caused the rise of Rome. Sorry, conservative Romaboo weirdos. Iuratus illo hoc morere. In case this is your first time joining us, welcome. I'm Sophie.
That's Latin.
And this is We Have Always Existed.
Means Ringo's an
It's a show that
educated
explores
man.
the vast and
Oh, I
beautiful
really hate
stories
him.
of transgender history and mythology from the ancient Mediterranean. And there's plenty. We've
Yeah,
barely
oftentimes,
scratched the
like,
surface of the topic today.
transgender
I've already
culture is
made a
usually the
bunch of video
result
essays
of,
on it, and there's plenty more
it's
source
just the
material
culture
from
of the
which to draw.
times, and
Don't
it's
worry,
a part
I'm
of
not running out
the
of ideas.
period.
But today, I wanted to explore the ancient Mediterranean from a slightly different angle. You've heard the idea that trans people caused the fall of Rome, I'm sure. But where did this idea come from? Is there any truth at all to it? And what actually did cause the fall of Rome? Is it even something we can know?
I don't think it was really one
We'll explore
thing.
these ideas today. Now, if you're here,
Like,
it's likely that
generally
you're a
speaking,
trans
the fall of
person, or
Rome
perhaps
occurred
someone
over
you
a
love
very
is,
long
or
period,
maybe
and
you
it
just
broke
like
up into
learning about history.
pieces, and
That's great.
as it
You're welcome to
transitioned
talk,
into
stick
different,
around.
like, states
But
of
on the off chance
power,
that you're here because you
it
find me
wasn't like just
objectionable, I
something
encourage
that
you to
happened
engage with the
overnight.
material in good faith, to listen to the arguments I make and consider them on their merits rather than on your preconceived notions. If I'm wrong, you have nothing to lose by listening, and you can walk away with your biases intact. But you just might be surprised. Feel free to comment on your thoughts below if you do disagree with me, but remember that this is a nuanced
I enjoy Sophie's
exploration
approach
of the
too,
topic,
because they're like, look,
complete
you're
with a
welcome to
long
critique me as
bibliography
long as you do it in
and
good
citations
faith.
linked below.
I'm just going to lay out these
So if you
arguments
think
and you
a
can
single
respond to them
cause in
however
a
you
random
want.
sentence is a valid response to such a thing, it's because you're letting your sad little feelings control you. And as someone once said, facts
Well,
don't
yeah,
care about your feelings. So,
it
did
reflects
trans
how
people
people
cause the fall
think.
of
You
Rome?
know, oh, I can
Before
defeat
we can answer that
a large
question,
amount of
we
research
need
with
to
a single
ask.
sentence.
Chapter
That's
1.
not generally how
What
scholarship
is the fall of
works.
Rome?
Criticism.
Just a nice, easy, simple topic here, no big deal. Empires fall all the time, right? And the explanation is always obvious. Some barbarian hordes, or lead in the drinking water, or woke.
So far, you know, it's like basically the premise is laid out for us to respond to. What caused the fall of Rome? Could it have been transgender people? If they caused the rise, why not the fall? What comes up must come down, right?
Gender ideology, right? Yeah, no.
Like
Turns
Foucault's
out
A
if we
History of
hang out what
Sexuality
causes the
would
fall of
describe
empires
gender as
is an
being sex
incredibly
and gender being
complicated
more
topic.
of an
In fact,
action
even
and
the
not an
date when the
identity
Roman
until
Empire
about the
fails is simple.
1800s
So before we
with the
answer
rise
the
of the
question,
bourgeoisie.
what caused the fall of Rome, we need to clarify what we mean by the fall of Rome in the first place. Maybe it's
Right.
easier to start with a simpler question. When did Rome fall? The most common date
Did
given for
Rome
the fall
fall?
of Rome is September 4th, 476 CE. On this day, the German barbarian Odoacer deposed the Emperor Romulus Augustus and declared himself king of Italy. So there were no more
It's
Roman
worth
emperors
noting
at that
that
point,
Rome
right?
continued to
Well,
exist like
Romulus
in
Augustus was a
pieces. You know,
small
there was
child when he became emperor.
the Holy Roman
His father, the
Empire,
general Orestes,
Charlemagne.
stuck his son on the throne after he deposed the previous emperor, Julius Nepos, who fled to Dalmatia, modern-day Croatia, Slovenia, around there. There, he continued to declare himself Roman emperor and ruled
And I
the
love this
Greek
because
state for
I
another
don't
40
know
years. So there was
fucking
still
any
a
of this
Western
stuff.
Roman
So
Empire ruled by a
I just
Western
think it's
Roman
interesting.
emperor. And the fact that they didn't hold the city of Rome itself is kind of irrelevant, since the capital of the empire in the west hadn't been moved to Ravenna in 401 CE. But okay, so it's done after 480 though, right? Well, other states cropped up around the same time, made up of former Roman territory that hadn't been conquered. None of these places was ruled by somebody who called themselves an emperor, but that was hardly unprecedented. After all, Augustus became the first emperor in 27 BCE, but the Roman state had existed for like 700 years before then. They didn't
I'm
always
not
have
really
an
saying
empire,
a
and
lot because
besides,
I'm like,
it's not their
okay, I'm
role
trying
to
to
create
like
a nation
follow along with
state.
this
Like,
history that
imagine
I'm
the
not like
capital of your
super
country was conquered by
familiar
an
with.
invading force, and
So
there
I'm
was
just like,
nobody left to
yeah,
be declared prime
okay.
minister or president or premier or whatever it is your country calls your leader.
But
That
basically,
doesn't
the
necessarily
idea
mean your
a state
country would
requires
cease to
someone to lead
exist,
it
right? Different regions
as a
went to
member of
colonial
that state,
governments,
as an
and others might
executive. And
move
if you
to
don't
create their own
have
successor
then
states,
it
but
must have
they're
fallen,
still a
right?
continuation of the country, even if they aren't the
But the
whole
continuation of the
country.
government,
But
even
one
if
by
it's not
one,
like
these
in
successor
whole,
states in the
there's still
West
pieces
fell
of it.
and eventually gave way to
And
the
the
kingdoms
idea
of
that
Italy and
Rome just
Europe.
completely disappeared
So,
overnight
had
certainly
Rome
isn't
fallen by
true,
then? Well, Odoacer ruled Italy like a
right?
Roman, more or less.
It's
He
like,
had the
did it
support of the
really
Roman
fall?
Senate, still had
Or did it just kind
consuls,
of limp
and
along and
didn't
break
change
up into
things much.
pieces?
There was some tension between the Romans of Italy and Odoacer's Germans who moved in there, but it was relatively minor and mostly limited to the beginning of his reign. But Odoacer was never able to establish a proper system of succession, and after being defeated by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, he was murdered at a banquet in March of 493. So, all right, is 493 the point at which the Roman Empire fell? Well, Theodoric also ruled Italy like a Roman.
Historians
He
like to
also
do
didn't
this.
change much
It's
in
very
terms of
difficult,
the administration
especially
of
with
the
ancient
peninsula.
history, to
But
nail down
Theodoric did
exactly when
eventually
something
die,
starts
of
or
course,
ends.
in
Usually you have like a
526
window
CE.
of time.
So is
The
that
early modern
when the
period,
Roman
for
Empire
instance,
fell?
is
Moving away from the chaos of
kind
the
of,
Roman Empire's collapse,
it's up in
we
the
still
air.
had a strong
There isn't
Roman
like a
Empire.
set year.
Wait, what? The Roman Empire was split in half permanently in
Yeah.
395
Yeah,
CE.
exactly. There was
It
the
was the
Western
Western
and the
Roman
Eastern Roman
Empire that
Empire.
fell in 476 or 480 or 493 or 526 or whatever. But the Eastern Roman Empire continued on for nearly another 1,000 years.
Right.
It's sometimes called the Byzantine Empire
The
to make it
Byzantine
easier for
Empire.
us to
And they
distinguish
still
it, but
referred to
that's on the
themselves, from
modern
what I
chart.
understand, as
They called
Romans.
themselves Romans, and that's exactly what
Yep.
they were. At one point, they even expanded westward,
So
reconquering
yeah,
a
the idea that
significant
Rome
chunk of
fell,
former
like
Roman
part of Rome
territory
fell.
in the 6th century CE, including the city of Rome itself. After many centuries of
And I'm not even
expansion
like
and
super
contraction,
au
though,
fait when it
the
comes
city of
to ancient history,
Constantinople, the
but
capital of the Eastern Roman
it's
Empire,
worth reminding
finally
ourselves
fell
that
in
the idea of Rome falling in
1453
totality
CE, and
is
the last
required so
Roman
that
emperor,
fascists
Constantine XI
can
Palaeologus, was killed or
basically
died.
demand revenge, a
So
scapegoat.
is
It's a very fascist
1453
idea.
the fall
And
of Rome.
fascists, by their very nature,
Constantinople was
are
also set for
ahistorical.
fall back in 1204 CE by the Fourth Crusade. They ended up destroying most of it, and a bunch of splinter states popped up after that.
Yeah,
One of
Constantinople
them was the
had a
city
lot
itself, ruled by Baldwin IX of Flanders, who
of
proclaimed
problems.
himself emperor. The Empire of Nicaea, a former Roman state, reasserted control over Constantinople in 1261.
Yeah, again, you
and proclaimed
constantly
the
with
empire to be
capital,
restored.
and
But after
the
this,
precursor
there
to
was no
capital
longer
is
an
territory
onward
that's
harmonious
constantly
succession
fought
from the
over,
original
from
single
city-states to
whole
nation-states.
Roman Empire. It was something
So
different.
this is just a
the city of
continuation
Rome
of
fell in
empire
1204 CE,
changing
more
hands
than
in terms of
200
who's
years before
ruling
that
it.
fateful day
But it
in
didn't just
1453.
disappear.
But wait, there's more. The Empire of Trebizond was one of those splinter states which broke away from the empire in 1204.
Yeah, there's so
CE.
many
Its
examples
rulers
of
called
power
themselves
changing
Roman emperors
hands.
as well.
But this
It was
isn't
made up
unto
of the north
itself a
coast of
fall, but
Anatolia
an
along
exchange
the
of
Black Sea
power
and
over the same
Crimea,
land.
where Mithridates and Hypsicrates
Meet the
made
new
their
boss,
own
same as the
boss
old
state against
boss,
the Romans
sort of.
1,500 years earlier, if you watched that video. The city of Trebizond itself fell in 1461, but the Crimean territories remained independent. Eventually, though, they too were conquered by the Ottomans. This was the last political remnant of the once mighty Roman Empire, and it fell in December of 1475. But wait, there's more. Constantinople
It's also
fell to
worth
the Ottoman
noting
Empire,
that
and the Sultan declared himself
1475, you're entering the
Caesar of Rome,
Renaissance
Caesar
and the
of
rise
Rome.
of
I really don't think this counts because he was
modern
a
nation
conqueror,
states.
and unlike Odoacer,
So
he
again,
made some
Rome
pretty
would have
massive
been
changes to the
absorbed or
administration of the
assimilated.
state. But if you disagree with me,
Again,
then you
power
could
is
say
just
that
sort of
Rome didn't
changing
fall until
form from the
1922,
feudal
when the
period
final Sultan of the Ottoman
on
Empire was
top of
deposed
what the Roman
after
Empire
World War
used to
I.
be out of the ancient world
It's also been
into
argued that the Russian Empire was the third
capitalism,
Rome,
as
the
it
second was the Eastern
started to
Empire,
turn
and the first,
into
of course, was the
by
whole thing, and therefore the
1475.
Russian Empire succeeded the Roman Empire.
Yes,
I think it's a silly
czars,
argument, but
right?
you can make the
Caesar,
argument.
czar.
But if that's the case, then what caused the fall of Rome? This guy.
Who was most
Other
definitely not
possible dates have
trans,
been argued as well. For example,
though he was
Diocletian
progressive
conquered the empire
in
for the
defense
first
of
time in
gender nonconforming
286
rights.
CE. It could be
Stalin
argued
wasn't,
that the Roman
though.
Empire became something different at that point than what it once was. I don't buy that one quite as much, but I guess there is an argument to be made for it.
It's worth noting
So
that
not only
throughout
is
all
it
of this,
complicated
the
to
fall of Rome
understand
is a myth that's
how
told
the Roman
to
Empire
justify
fell,
violence
it's
against
not even
different groups
straightforward to
now.
say when the Roman Empire fell. Besides, most historical nation states don't usually have a clean end date,
Right.
and the difference to the average person may have been
There's a
basically
transition, if you
imperceptible.
will.
If you were a Roman who lived in Italy, September 5th, 476 may have just felt like another normal day.
Yep.
Classicists and historians like clean specific dates, so we know when to stop caring about whatever topic we're reading about, but that's
That's
really
generally
not
not
how
how it
history
works, though, in
works.
reality.
All that said,
And even
when we
like
talk
in the
about
study
the
of things
fall of Rome,
gothically,
the
we're less
average person
concerned
with a surface
about
level
sort of a
understanding
clean
of this
ending
stuff
because the
usually
Gothic is
thinks of it
concerned
as
with power is
476 CE.
constantly
But as we've
decaying
just seen,
and
it's nowhere
transferring.
near that simple. In fact, one could make the argument that Rome
The
never
Gothic
fell in the
chronotope,
first place,
the
but
constant
simply
historical
changed
reminders in
forms.
a
After all, many of the
plastic
people in the
space
former
that
Western Roman
is
territories retained their Roman
reminding the people
identity, and
inside it of
Greeks
dynastic
referred to
primacy and
themselves as Romans
hereditary
for
rights.
centuries as they chafed
So
under
it's very
Ottoman rule.
plastic
So the
in the
idea of
Gothic,
Roman as an
Neo
identity
Gothic specifically.
continued even after the nation state bearing its name collapsed. So where does this fascination with the fall of Rome come from? People had been Yeah, dude, I know. People had been speculating about why Rome fell for a long time, but it was sparked in a big way by Edward Gibbon when he published his book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in 1776. Certainly the most interesting thing to happen that year.
A
We'll
fascination
take
with
a
the
closer look
collapse
at
of
his more present.
antiquity is
His ideas
something
have
to
mostly fallen
encounter
out
in
of
a very
fashion, but he started
Ozymandian
a
kind of way.
centuries-long
Definitely
conversation
would
on the
have started
topic that
happening
we're forced to
during the
deal today as
Enlightenment,
reactionary know-nothing
from
dinguses who
Napoleon
base
and
their
the French
historical
Revolution,
takes
the
based
British
on
Romantic
vibes from
poets,
sources I've heard
onwards into the
just
age of
the other night. And
imperialism.
trust me, bro.
And I'm speaking in a very conversational kind of way here, but that's kind of how the Gothic works, right? We take a ahistorical approach to history that comments on historical facts in ways that are kind of loosey-goosey. And meanwhile, what I really like about Sophie's video is they're giving all of these historical examples that kind of speak to the same things at play, power, and how there isn't this precise kind of moment that fascists are looking for, but one that I, as a Gothicist, a neo-Gothicist, can hint at through the poetics that I work with. So Sophie and I are kind of two sides of the same coin as far as that goes. As anti-fascists, as trans people, we have a vested interest in resisting the kind of approach that fascists have while working with history versus a history, I guess. So this part is surviving capitalism, an interlude.
Interlude. If you've watched this far, thank you so much for doing so. It's hard to make it these days, so this is the part of the video where I let you know all the ways I'm finding to survive under capitalism. I know it's annoying to have every YouTuber do this, but until we all get off our collective duffs and overthrow capitalism, this is the best we have to work with. If it makes you feel any better, I'm equally annoyed by having to put this
You
in the video
exist
in the
within
first place.
society,
Think of this
and you
like
try
an
and make
ad read,
society
except
better.
this time it's for my own stuff and not for like a sponsor or anything. Let's start with the simple stuff. Like, comment, subscribe, hype, you know what to do. This tells the algorithm that people like you like stuff like this. So if you like stuff like this, like stuff like this. I believe trans people deserve to know and own
Here you
our
go.
own histories. If you think so too, feed the algorithm. The algorithm hungers. The algorithm must consume. Also, I'm a voice feminization coach. If you've watched my
This is
videos
something I've
before,
thought
you
about
might notice
doing.
that primary
I
sources
don't
are read
pass,
in a much different
so
voice.
I have
But
this
that's
deep
still my
voice, and I thought, Sophie could
I
teach
worked
me
hard
how
to
to
feminize my own voice, and I can help
talk
you
like
as
a
well.
girl.
Hit me up. My email's in the description. The first session is free, and after that, I offer a pretty broad sliding scale.
First one's
Next,
free.
my books. YouTube has been a great way to share transgender history so far, but who knows how much longer it'll be around for. That's why I've begun
Exactly,
turning
right?
video
I've spent so
content
much
into
time
zines.
backing up my own
Putting this
work,
work in
not on
physical
YouTube,
form
because
and getting it
on
into
YouTube,
hands of
trans
as many
people don't
people as
tend to have a lot of
possible will
power.
help these stories continue to survive no matter what happens in the coming years. The first one is based on the video on the Inaris and is available now in ebook and in physical form. Half the proceeds from sales of these will go to Rainbow Railroad, an organization that helps LGBTQ2IA
I've heard
people
of the Rainbow
who live
Railroad.
under oppressive regimes to relocate to Canada. You can also buy a copy of my novel, The Bottom Line, through a link in the description. It's a science fiction novel which has nothing at all to do with this channel's subject matter, but whatever. It's a story about identity and how to navigate life when your
Cool.
identity is taken away from you through the lens of automation in near future Toronto. I have some first editions left. I think there's like 20 of them left right now. So if you buy one of these, I'll sign it for you. After that, no promises. You can also support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a member. It starts at just $1 a month, and if you like the idea of helping others learn transgender history, it makes a huge difference. You'll get access to the server's exclusive Discord server, free ebook copies of my books, a personalized thank you video, and a whole lot more. Now, without further ado.
It's really important to recognize that this kind of work isn't free. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it's very easy for people to come along and treat it like a sandcastle to kick, and also at the same time for someone who's asking for compensation for their labor to basically be discredited. So I completely get that. It happens to me all the time, especially if you're not on YouTube like I am, given the nature of my work as a sex worker and academic tied to that. Sex worker, activist, what have you. Those are all things that fascism hates. So it's very easy for people to come along and kick my sandcastle, but also I would imagine that Sophie has had people approach them and kick theirs as well. So if you feel like supporting them, please do, because this is excellent stuff. It's free, right? So why not compensate something? Even just a like, a share, a subscribe, it makes a world of difference. So at this point, chapter 2, why did Rome fall? We've already kind of established that the fall of Rome is kind of a difficult thing. So for all intents and purposes, I'm going to go into this part of the video thinking to myself, fall equals a scapegoat argument. It's a false flag, a casus belli, if you will.
Chapter 2. Why did Rome fall? Oh boy, this one's a doozy. There are like 1,000 different reasons people give for why Rome fell. And yes, one of them is because of
Well, it's such a
trans people, which is
large
a ridiculous
empire.
idea, but we'll take a
There were
closer look
enemies
at that.
within, enemies
Historian
outside.
Alexander Dumont spammed a list of 210 different factors that caused the fall of Rome back in 1984. And since then, plenty more have been added to the list. I can't possibly address every one of these because that would be honestly.
If someone says
as
it's
hell,
trans
and I've
people
already
now, they're
committed to
just
not writing a video as long as
basically
we
making a
have Cypress
scapegoat
video unless it's a really interesting topic. If
for
somebody wants,
capitalism,
they could
which is
probably
kind of a
create an
stand-in
entire
for
video
Rome,
essay channel picking
defending
apart each of
civilization
those
as we know it.
210 ideas, but there are plenty of things I'd rather do with my time, so we'll just glance over a bunch of them today while resisting the urge to go off on a whole bunch of historical tangents, which y'all know I love to do. So if
I
we
can
take
relate to that.
476 as the date Rome fell, obviously it fell because Odoacer showed up and took over, so easy peasy. Odoacer caused the fall of Rome, but it's not like barbarians were a new thing. Rome had dealt with them throughout its history. If Odoacer had shown up in the
And
days
it
of Scipio
continued to deal with
Africanus
them
or
into
Julius
the
Caesar
modern
or
era.
Agrippa,
The
he'd
whole
have been
point of
easily dealt with, I'm
Gothic
sure.
is this
Now,
idea
when you
of the
consider that
barbarian sort of being
barbarian
inside
just
the
means someone who
house.
wasn't a Greek or a Roman, it could be argued that the
The barbarian had
entirety of Roman
assimilated, but there
history
was
is
this sense of
defined
the
by her
alien or the
relationship with her
imposter.
barbarian neighbors.
And that would continue
Some
from the
of the key
Enlightenment
elements of Roman
into
history,
capitalism
the
as we
original
know it.
sagging of Rome in 390 BCE, the Three Punic
Late
Wars, the
stage
slave
capitalism,
revolt led
that
by
is.
Spartacus, Caesar's conquest of Gaul, the Teutoburg forest disaster, and so many more were all directly linked to barbarians.
I would argue that
Even
it was
Christianity
probably
itself is a
multiple
barbarian
things.
religion
That'd
originating
be my
in Judea.
guess.
So
It
Rome
wasn't
had dealt
just
with
one
barbarians
thing
for
that
centuries.
led to the
As
downfall
time
of
went
Rome
on, though,
any more than
Rome
the
was simply
Soviet
less able to deal with them.
Empire
Okay,
and the
so
United States.
what made Rome so weak that Odoacer could just stroll in and take over? A bunch of stuff. One of the Roman
Right?
Emperor Augustus's greatest mistakes was in never establishing a proper line of succession for the position of princeps, what the Romans called emperor. He was the first one, after all. It's almost funny when you read the history. He only ever had one child, his daughter Julia, and a woman couldn't be
A similar
emperor because
problem
Augustus
to
was already dead.
Alexander,
So they
right?
had
There's
his
no
general and best boy,
established
Agrippa, marry
right
Julia
of
and had
succession,
some
so
babies to be
people
his
are
heirs.
constantly fighting
That gave
over
him Lucius,
power.
who died of an illness in 2 CE. But that's okay because they also had a second son, Gaius, but he died of an illness in 4 CE. But
And the
that's
idea of
okay, 'cause they also
husbandry
had
and
a third son,
bloodlines is
Agrippa Postulus,
wrought
but
with
he was
peril,
apparently a
right? The
maniac,
Gothic,
so Augustus couldn't use
dynastic
him as
primacy,
an
and
heir either,
hereditary
so
rights.
he had to go with
As with
Tiberius,
feudalism,
the
the
intelligent and
emperors
capable
and the
but
way that they
reclusive
could
and moody son
sort
of
of
Augustus's
dictate
wife,
a
Livia
peaceful, there
Drusilla,
was
from
no
another
peaceful
marriage.
transfer of power.
More Spinal Tap
It
drama
was
powers
up for
here. But by
grabs. There
establishing
were
a
just
system in
constant
which the
power
emperor
vacuums,
had to
right?
declare his successor, he set things up for failure. Because what happens when the emperor dies without a declared heir? Of course, you end up with a power vacuum, and the highly ambitious
Right?
and powerful aristocrats
See, that's the
of the Roman
Gothic's bread and
Empire
butter.
hoard a
And
vacuum.
we got that from
So you
Rome
end up with things like
and
the Year
older
of the Four
forms of
Emperors in 69
democracy,
CE. We're
republic,
not doing
empire.
that nice thing anymore, by the way. That stopped being cool when Elon Musk latched onto it. Nero died without declaring an heir in 68, so the General Galba marched on Rome and took power. But the legions in Germany
Rome was
refused to
basically in a
recognize him and
constant
declared their
state of
general
flux.
Vitellius to be emperor. 9 months later, on January 15th, 69 CE, one of Galba's allies, Otho, murdered him and had himself declared emperor. After losing
And if you
a key
look at the
battle
money
against
with
Vitellius,
the
Otho
presidents
took
on the
himself out,
coins, very
and
similar
Vitellius
to
marched
Roman
on the city and
emperors,
declared himself emperor 4
America
months
is
later.
basically the modern day
A couple months
variant
later,
of
the
Rome.
general
It's where
Vespasian was
power is
declared emperor
structured.
by his troops, who
And
defeated
it has
Vitellius's
become
forces
more and
in
more
October,
stable
and in
because
December,
capital
he entered the city,
was
murdered Vitellius,
set
and
up
became emperor.
under America in
Wow,
ways that could
man, the Roman
guarantee a
Emperor
relatively
Vespasian's
peaceful
dynasty is
transfer of
called the
power.
Flavian dynasty
But Rome
because
lasted
his full
much
name was
longer than
Titus
America
Flavius
did.
Vespasianus. He was able to hold
America,
power for a while
under
after the
capital,
chaos of
is quite
69, but
unstable.
his heir Titus died after only 2 years in the purple. His second son Domitian died without an heir himself, but the Romans were fortunate to have Nerva, who was declared emperor by the Senate almost immediately after Domitian died. Nerva made sure to declare an heir, Trajan, and then died pretty quickly before Trajan had a chance to. Really good move on his part. Way to take one for the team, Nerva. Nerva was the first of the 5 good emperors. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus
I remember
Pius,
the 5
Marcus
good
Aurelius.
emperors.
This was a period of relative stability for the empire, but what happened after that? Marcus Aurelius
No
is
female
ship
emperors,
Commodus ruled the empire for a while.
I think.
If you've
Could be
seen
wrong.
Gladiator, Commodus is the emperor in that movie. It's fiction, of course, but from what we can tell, he was about as awful as they portrayed him to be in the film. After that, we get 193 CE, the year of the 5
I would imagine that
emperors,
most
before
of the
Septimius
emperors were
Severus
probably
came on.
relatively
Elagabalus was
awful
part of his
people.
dynasty, if you recall.
And also, why do they have the hearts for eyes? If you look at the little
CE.
statues, I
And
always
in the
wondered
Roman
that.
province of Britannia, there was even a year of the 3 prime ministers. Wild. What kind of stability can you build in a system that allows mayhem like this? When your culture rewards ambition above all other things, your citizens will work only toward
You could argue
personal
that it's
gain
baked into the
instead of
system,
greater good of
right?
your civilization. They'll use the force of government to do it too.
Might
They'll
makes
suppress their
right.
political opponents,
To the victor
attack
go
their
the
own
spoils.
citizens, and do whatever they need to accrue more power. When you
Yeah.
have a culture like that, what do you think is going to happen? Eventually,
It's a
the
culture of
empire was
lies,
divided into
slavery,
4 by
theft.
Diocletian,
Not so
then
different from
reconstituted
nowadays,
into
except
2
it's
under
not automated
Constantine
to
and
nearly the same
Licinius, then
degree.
1 again under just Constantine, then into 3 by his heirs, then 1 again under Constantius, then 2 again under Valentinian and Valens, then 1 again for a final time under Theodosius in 395 CE, after which point it was permanently divided. But even amid all this chaos, it was still inconceivable to many Romans that their empire was in decline. The city of Rome was sacked in 410
Similar to
CE,
America,
but
right?
just a decade earlier, the
People
poet
living
Claudian
within
wrote,
a given
quote,
space and time think that
"There
where
will
they're
never
living
be
is
an
eternal,
end to the power
that
of
it can't
Rome."
crumble.
On top of that, there was no real hierarchy below that of the emperor.
It's
outside
basically
of
an
the
early
original
form
forces
of
alone.
capitalist
It's not
realism,
like
right?
modern countries where there's a
State
clear path of
realism,
succession.
from
Like
city
here in
states to
Canada,
nation
if
states
the
to
prime minister
capital
dies, the
more
ruling
broadly.
party appoints a new one. In the US, if the president dies, the vice president takes over, but the Romans didn't
Goes
have
all the way
that.
back to
So
Plato's
when an
Republic,
emperor died
right?
unexpectedly, which
The
happens
shadows
pretty
on the
often
cave
during a
wall
crisis,
basically
anybody with enough
conceive
power
people of
could take
something
its
that is
place.
hyper real,
That
even
caused
when
a
in
lot
decay.
of civil wars.
The
There were
space
plagues too.
beyond the
In
illusion
262 CE,
of the
looks like
cave
5,000
is crumbled
people a
as
day
dust.
died in the city of Rome itself alone. And
So that's been
2/3
going
of
on
the
for thousands
population
of
of
years.
Alexandria died around the same time. But that's a long time before 476. Now, to pagan writers, the decline of Rome was obvious. The state had turned its back on the old gods to whom they owed so much in favor of this weird barbarian cult from Judea. Theodosius banned the worship of pagan gods and closed the temples, and he was the last emperor to rule over a united empire. Coincidence? I think not. No, this idea is obviously silly, but I think there's something to be said about religious strife causing a lot of problems for Rome.
It
The
certainly would
Christian
have helped, right?
persecutions of the early
Paganism,
Mid Empire
Judaism,
were meant to help create a sense
Christianity,
of unity among Romans,
and
but
Rome,
instead they
after
just
a
ended up
certain
causing
point,
further divisions
would have
and made people
converted to
distrustful of their
Christianity
own
under the Byzantines,
communities.
right?
How
Or
interesting
thereabouts.
that the persecution of a misunderstood and oppressed minority within your society doesn't actually improve morale or material conditions for
And
anybody.
the
If they
idea of
learned from that
Revelations,
and are much smarter in the
Christians being
21st
mistreated by the
century,
Romans after the death of
it was a
Christ
good
would
move,
have
of
led
course, for
to
Constantine
the
to declare
period
the
that's
empire
commonly
officially
recognized
tolerant
as the
for
fall.
Christianity. Religious tolerance and pluralism are important aspects of any civilized society. You can't become a great society when you expend resources oppressing and persecuting your own citizens. But then
It takes
Theodosius
energy.
decided to return to the
Fascism
misery
is
of the past
capital
and
in
ban
decay.
pagan worship in
Same idea with
391
empire
CE.
more
This
broadly.
isn't helpful,
And
homeboy.
the
The
imperialism
persecution of
comes home
Christians
to
for 3
empire.
centuries didn't help make the empire any better. So why would persecution of pagans be any different? Now, what of the Roman army? It was much larger in the late empire in the past, which was a necessity in an increasingly dangerous world. They also relied more on cavalry at this point, but it cost about as much to maintain a horse as it did a foot soldier, so an army made up of cavalry cost twice as much. Their commanders were also now mostly professional soldiers rather than local magistrates or senators seeking glory, but that was good. Actually, it made them more effective. Now, you may have read criticism that the army of the late empire was made up mostly of barbarian soldiers who were less loyal to the empire. Now, the former is true. There were a lot of Germanic soldiers recruited into the Roman army to swell its ranks. But there's no evidence that a Germanic Roman career general ever betrayed the empire. Germanic tribal
Right,
leaders,
that
oh
would be
sure,
like a
plenty of those.
scapegoat argument. It must
Alaric,
have been
Theodoric,
a
Odoacer,
barbarian at the
the list
gate.
goes on.
Totally
But
didn't
that's
happen
not the
from
same
someone
thing.
inside the empire.
Alaric and Theodoric extorted military commands from the Romans, and Odoacer just invaded. Similarly, our sources never mention Germanic troops being unruly, less effective, or less reliable. This attitude also brushes aside the literally
I'm noticing
hundreds
like a
of
pattern
years of
here
civil war
insofar as
between
fascists
Roman-born generals who
often look
coveted power.
for
Turns out when the
someone to
Romans do
blame.
it, it's strong and
Oh, it
virtuous,
must have
just part
been
of the way
a
things are.
barbarian,
But when Germans do
which
so,
is
it's
unto
very
itself is a
civilized
form of
and
bigotry.
savage. So foreigners
It's
didn't
basically
make
the
them
earliest
worse,
form of
as it turns
racism,
out.
right?
Go figure. Immigration is good, actually. Multiculturalism is good, actually. People are
Right,
not
and
inherently
blaming
less
barbarians
trustworthy
is
because they
basically
come from a
blaming
different place than
immigrants,
you. Just
looking
because
for a
some Germans were
scapegoat.
jerks doesn't mean all Germans were jerks. You're just doing a racism. Racism against Germans. Go
Yep.
figure. This entire video so far is basically me talking through all the reasons conservatives give for why the West is in decline and how
Yep.
they're either
And the same
nonsense or the
arguments that are
fault
used
of
today
conservatism
were
in the
the
first
same
place.
basic
Those who
arguments that were
cannot
used
remember the past are condemned to
back
repeat
in the
it,
day.
and those who can are condemned to watch in horror while others repeat it. Anyway,
That's
what
the
else we
Gothic
got?
for
There are
you.
plenty more factors that may have contributed to the fall of Rome,
Cryptomimesis.
but I don't
Between
want to get
pieces
into
of
all of them. Here's
language
a list of some
is
other ideas
trapped
people have suggested on it.
the
Screen right here.
horrors of
So, what
present
caused the fall
structures
of
tied to
Rome?
older structures.
A bunch of
It
stuff.
goes to the counterfeit.
Chapter 3. Did more
And the idea that between these pieces of language, between like the pieces of language that the echo of history is made up of, you can see what's happening in the past repeating itself in a way that's very like tenebrous, shadowy. And every dystopian novel, you have what I refer to as the liminal hauntology of war through the boom and bust, not just of capital, but of empire more broadly, out from Rome into the present day and everything in between. There is this constant shadowy echo or oscillation. Cryptomimesis is one word for it, the ghost of the counterfeit. And often in Gothic, it's communicated through ghost stories, the slaying of Caesar and the haunting of Brutus and others by Caesar's ghost into the present day, what I call the Caesarian numinous, and this abortive offshoot of empire, essentially vis-a-vis Rudolf Otto and various other arguments besides in Gothic theory, is something to keep in mind as well. So that's the kind of shit that I would get into and sort of muck about with. Medusa and various other numinous entities tied to pre-Roman ideas that would be absorbed into the empire and would survive as well as ghosts. So you're kind of dealing with ghosts upon ghosts and good ghosts, bad ghosts, but they occupy the same space. And it is quite important to keep those in mind when asking questions like these. Did moral decay cause the fall of Rome? Guess we'll have to find out, huh?
moral decay cause the fall of Rome? One of the reasons I love making these videos is that I get to read a
It's a
lot
very
of
common
intelligent work
fascist
by a
argument.
lot of
Someone must
intelligent
have
people,
corrupted
and
the
then I get to
youth, the women,
synthesize it into something
the things that
easily
keep the state
digestible for
together.
you. But
It's a
nobody
moral
intelligent
panic,
has written about
essentially.
moral decay
And
causing
that
the
is
fall of
nothing
Rome for
new,
a
even if
long
it's
time.
very widespread under
So I'm
capital,
going
which
to have to
automates
dig into
these
some real
devices.
stinkers here. Anyway, what
They
follows
would have
is a
existed
quick,
under empire.
relatively speaking, historiography of the fall of Rome due to moral decay or degeneracy or whatever you want to call it.
Degeneracy, yeah.
If you're new to that term,
Fascists borrowed and stole
historiography is
old
basically
arguments.
a history of history. It's a study
Hmm.
of historical writings,
Yep.
examining how different historians reach their conclusions and how ideas about history have changed over time. This isn't going
I
to
would
be
play
a
out with the
complete
poetic side of
in-depth
this.
study of the
First and
historiography of
foremost,
the fall of
RE,
Rome because it's not
ghosts.
that
The
interesting
ghost
a
of the
topic
counterfeit.
today.
The gothic
We're
fake
necessarily
that
skipping
is
over a
echoing some
lot,
kind of
including
hidden
some important
barbarity.
ones like
Closer
Montesquieu,
to home, the
Adrian
call coming from
Goldsworthy,
inside the
and like
house.
so many others. But I hope to show you at least a few examples of where the idea came from.
I don't know who
and how
any
it
of these
led to
people
our
are, by
modern
the way.
ideas. I'll try to keep it brief, but you know how I am. For our
Like,
purposes
give me
today, we'll
Creed,
consider moral
Kristeva,
decay to
Hogel.
be a
I'll be like, okay, I know
deterioration
who
in
they are.
society's ethics, shared values, and a mutual trust between individuals. This idea
But I still
actually
basically
goes all the
understand
way
what
back to
Sophie's
the
saying
waning
in this
days of the Roman
situation.
Empire in the West. So let's take a look at our earliest example, Salvianus of Marseille. Rome had turned its back on its old gods, and shortly later in 410 CE, Germanic barbarians sacked the city. This was the first time in exactly 800 years the city of Rome had faced violence at the hands of a foreign invader. 390 BCE was the last time. So,
The
to
idea
late
of an
Roman pagan
invading
writers, as we
barbarian,
mentioned, their reason was
very
obvious.
gothic
They
idea.
betrayed the very gods who helped them rise to primacy in the Mediterranean in favor of this weird Jewish cult. This was such a common belief that St. Augustine prodded his disciple Orosius to write a survey of Roman history.
I will say
showing
that moral panics are often tied to religious
worse stuff
bodies
happened under
that
the
are
pagan
losing
gods than the
control.
Christian one.
And
Yes,
to
things
maintain
got worse
control, like
even
any
Christianity
state
was
in
under
crisis, the
revolution.
church
The
included,
priest
they
Salvianus
invent
of
scapegoats,
Marseille, or just
usually an
Salvian, wrote
opposing
De
religion.
Gubernatione Dei, or On the Management of God. In it, he argues that terrible things were happening in the Roman world because both Christians and pagans were falling into corruption and degeneracy. Scholar J.J. Saunders argues it's Salvian's work that sparks
The world as they know it
is
is in chaos. So rather than blame the system through state realism, they'll essentially make the argument that, well, there must be something wrong. The world is ending because of degeneracy, not because the system is flawed.
Which would certainly have colored his views on the world. He was probably an aristocrat by birth as well, and the fact that Roman aristocrats weren't necessarily safe during this period must also have influenced him. Early in life, he married a woman named Palladia and had a daughter named Auspiciola. Eventually, though, the two of them separated. Salvian went to a monastery and Palladia joined a convent of nuns. They may not have divorced, though it's not clear. We also don't know what happened to Auspiciola. Maybe she joined the
It's very
monastery
common
with
with
Salvian
history,
and changed his
especially
name to
ancient history,
Auspiciolas. While at
where
the monastery,
there's plenty of times
Salvian was
that
probably
historians will
ordained as a
say, well,
priest.
we just don't
Now,
know.
if you're surprised that he was a priest but may have still been married, you're not alone. There were various
In the Gothic,
attitudes toward
they
priests and marriage,
invent
but
some
it wasn't
historical
officially
manuscript,
banned until
pass
the
it off as
Second
genuine,
Lateran
and then say it
Council
was fake
in
later.
139 CE. So he could have been a priest and been married. In fact, one of his friends at the monastery was the bishop Eucher, who was also married and had 2 children. Go figure. But even today, there are some married priests. In the Eastern Catholic Church, a married man can be ordained, but an ordained man can't marry. But even in the West, some married Protestant ministers who converted to Catholicism have been ordained as priests. Anyway, Salvian was well known as a preacher, and we can see that in his writing style. The way they're written, it seems like his works started off as sermons before being repurposed. We're told he was alive toward the end of the 5th century, at which point he would have been nearly 100 years old, notable at any period, even today, but especially so during the chaos of the 5th century. So when it comes to the fall
Yeah,
of the
that's
Roman
wild.
Empire, he's the closest thing we have to an eyewitness account. Great place to start. He probably wrote De Gubernatione Dei between 439 and 450 CE, which was, of course, a rough time for the Romans in the West.
Yeah, oftentimes
So,
people
what's
who
his
live
argument?
to be that
He
old
doesn't
are
even bother
wonderful
engaging with the
primary
idea that Rome is
sources
falling because it abandoned
because
its
they've
own
lived
gods.
and seen so
His
much.
primary audience is his fellow
You
Christians.
see that
after
today,
all,
people who
and
are
maybe
100 years
convincing
old
of that. He also did
can
not put much stock in the
recount
idea some
periods in
Christians had at the
time
that
from
God
earlier
took a
centuries,
hands-off approach to
literally
the
because they
universe.
lived
He spends most
during
of the
them.
first 2 books pointing out a bunch of scripture passages that show God always takes a direct, hands-on approach to the universe. That's why he called his book De Gubernatione Dei, The word gubernatione is related to management, but it can also mean steering, like steering a ship. So no, it's not because God is indifferent to the world. Instead, he insists that it's this idea in the first place that leads to abandoning God and his message and laws for the world at every level of society. What does this look like? Salvian tells us about an argument often made by the
Again,
wealthy
this is
Roman
all new
society, that the
information for
poor
me.
and
I'm like,
slaves
oh
are
wow, cool.
untrustworthy thieves.
Like,
But if
I don't
that's
know
true,
about the
it's the
religious
fault of the rich in the first
complexities of
place.
the Roman
Quote,
Empire at the time of its
First of all,
supposed
if
fall.
slaves are thieves, they are perhaps forced to steal through want. Even though the customary allowances are given, these allowances satisfy custom rather than sufficiency.
I like
and
when
thus
Sophie
fulfill the
does
law
these
without fulfilling the
voiceovers
need.
when they're reading
Their
block
indulgence
quotes,
makes their fault less
because then they
blameworthy,
do the
because
deep
the guilt
voice.
of a thief who is unwillingly forced into theft
Vocal
is
fry
excused.
for the win.
Holy Scripture seems to excuse in part the offense of the needy when it says, "The fault is not so great when a man has stolen, for he steals to feed his hungry soul." He steals
And this kind
to
of quote
feed
is
his
basically
hungry
giving an
soul.
idea
For this reason, they who are excused by the divine
within a
word
moral
are not
panic,
very
you
well
know,
to be
or
accused
an
by
attempt to
us.
describe the world as
So
he
it's
knew
not
it
great to steal.
in chaos.
Naturally, that's one of the 10 Commandments after all. Salvian doesn't excuse it, but he does point out that even Scripture tells us it's not so bad if you're desperate. That quote he used is from Proverbs 6:30, by the way. It's not the fault of the poor if they steal to survive, says Salvian. The same is true for if they're untrustworthy. They lie because they know they'll be in for a rough punishment if they tell the truth. Now, here's another bit I want to read for no particular reason at all.
But you, the noble and rich, who have an overflow of all good things, who because of this should honor God by your holy works, because you enjoy his blessings unceasingly, let us see whether your actions
I'm
are,
being kind of
I do
quiet
not say
because I'm
holy,
just
but
trying to
at
follow
least
along.
harmless. And as I have said before, who among the rich, with a few exceptions, is not tinged with all manner of crime? I speak now about none except him alone, who knows that what I say applies to himself. If what I say is outside his conscience, my speech will in no way injure him. If he knows in his heart what I speak about, let him realize these things are not spoken by my tongue, but by his own conscience.
Damn. If ultra-wealthy people had a conscience, this would be devastating. From here, he goes on to describe the avarice of the ultra-wealthy of Rome and the Roman state itself. I won't go through the whole thing, but
A class
here are some of
critique.
his bangers, in no particular order.
By the encroachments of the powerful, the weak lose their belongings, or even themselves along with their belongings. Consider the remedies recently given to some cities. What have they done but make all the rich immune and pile more taxes on the wretched poor? The rich have become richer by lessening the obligations which they bore lightly. The poor are dying from the multiplication of the burdens.
There
which
is
they
nothing
were
more
already
vicious than the
unable to
rich who
bear.
are destroying the
Hence
poor
it is,
by their
I make the
remedies,
observation
and
that
none
there is
more
nothing
unfortunate
vicious
than the
than
poor
the
whom
rich
those
who are
things
destroying
kill,
the
which are
poor
given
by
as a
their
remedy to
remedies,
all.
and none more unfortunate
This
than the
doesn't seem
poor
to
whom those things kill,
make
which
the
are
rich
given
sound
as a
very
remedy
good.
to all. Do we think we are unworthy of the punishment of divine severity when we thus constantly punish the poor? Do we think
Again,
when
it's
we are
very common
constantly
for the
wicked, that
rich
God
to
should
become
not
alienated
exercise
from
his
everything
justice
around them and
among us?
basically take advantage
Where or in
of poor
whom
people.
are evils so great? Except
So this
among
is just a
Samaritans and
continuation
Romans.
of,
Damn, am I reading Salvian or Marx? He does
right?
talk about other things as well, including the fact that the old gods are still worshipped.
Well,
and that
it
modern
goes to
devices
show that
such as
Marx,
the theater and the
the
circus
specters
sweat
haunting
saves
Europe
most of
were
his
as
wealth
old
for
as the
the
Roman
ultra-wealthy
Empire.
of Rome, who consistently make life worse for the poor in
And
order
it's
to enrich
important
themselves,
for
with no care for how
all
it
of you to
affects
keep in
anyone
mind
else.
that as
Grab
I'm
yourself a
watching this,
copy
I don't know
and
who the
just start
fuck
reading from any
that person
page.
was,
There's a pretty good chance
but
you'll
I was
find
like,
him
wow,
ranting about how
it's a
awful
class
the
critique.
ultra-wealthy in Rome are, and I am absolutely here for it. His argument, though, is biblical. He
Nearly,
draws upon
what,
scripture
1500
many
years before
times as he
Marx,
points
give
out
or
how
take?
awful the wealthy are. And if you want to find scripture that talks about the evils of greed and exploitation of the poor,
Money is the
you'll
root of all
find
evil.
plenty.
That's from the Bible.
That's one of the reasons right-wing
And Christ
Christians are so
set aside your
opposing
worldly
today.
Possessions.
Oppression
Christ
of
was
the
a
poor is
communist
antithetical
zombie,
to
that
so
kind of thing.
much of what's actually written in the Bible.
Heresy.
So what in particular was Salvian referring to here?
And it's also
As
worth
Theodosius
repeating that the
declared,
idea
Roman
of
tax
Christian
collectors didn't get to choose their career. They were chosen at birth
mercy
and
and
had to collect as much
generosity and
tax as the
compassion
government
for the
told them
poor
to.
was seen as
If a tax collector fell
heretical
short,
in
he
the
had to
eyes of
pay
the
difference
Romans,
himself,
who,
so
up
he
until a
had no
certain
choice
point
but to be
around the
blamed
time
about
of the
it.
fall, were
And the
pagan.
heavier the taxes got, the harsher tax collectors had to be. There was a particular tax on the poor as well. It was called
The state was
capitatio.
basically
There's
entering
more than one
crisis,
capitatio, though, so
and it did
if you
so
look it
through
up,
the
you might get
persecution
confused.
of
This
Christians
one was a
and
tax on everyone in the
Jews.
empire, but if you owned land or were part of the patrician class, you didn't have to pay it. So the poorer you were, the more likely you were to have to pay this tax.
Which
Even
led
slaves had
to
to pay it rough.
crisis.
But here's the thing, the property tax was too much for some property owners to bear as well. So if you were a farmer who owned a small parcel of land and the tax collector showed up and demanded more than you could pay, what were your options? Really, there was only one. You'd go to a wealthier landowner and give up your ownership of the land in exchange for him paying your taxes. Then you
I
could
mean,
continue
it was
to live
something
on
that
the
would
land
happen
and
in the
work it for a new
Renaissance
owner.
period,
But then,
right?
because you no
Where
longer owned the
landowners could
you
say,
had to pay the
well, if you
capitatio as
inherit
well,
this
so
land,
you were
but
sort
you
of out
can't
of the
afford
way.
to
This
pay
is the
this fee that we
predecessor
set
of the
up,
system
then
of
we
the
just
feudal
take your
lords and
land.
serfs.
It was a way
What
of
would emerge
basically
in the later
taking
medieval
land
era?
away
So
from
the rich got
people.
richer, the
Instead
poor
of being
stayed
able to
poor,
resurf the
and the middle
land,
class
they could
disappeared.
basically
This
force
was a
people to
major
exist within
problem in Rome,
early
but
stages of
particularly
capital.
in Roman Gaul. We talked earlier about how
There's
Sauron
always
was
some
a
kind
key
of
witness
trick
to the
that
destruction
landowners
of
use
Augusta Treverorum.
to
Now, you might
the
think
ruling
of
class
rabid hordes of
specifically to
maniacs
get more and more
frothing at the
land.
mouth to murder anybody in sight, but
Accumulation.
Salvian seems mostly to be angry at the Roman aristocracy over it. Why? Because he actually lived among the people of Roman Gaul. That's one of the big differences between him and today's talking heads. They're just millionaires paid by billionaires to convince thousandaires that hundredaires are the problem. They spread their propaganda and divide us working class folk with
Yep.
no understanding of any of our material conditions. No, the barbarian invaders were just people.
In my work, I
like anyone
constantly
else.
stress
Like anyone
alienation
else,
is something
they
we have to
just wanted a
overcome
place to live and
when
to
in
feel
Rome
safe. This is true of all
to
immigrants,
reverse
by
the
way, and
objection
this is a great
process. You have to get closer and
opportunity
closer
for
to
me to
those
segue
more
into talking
oppressing
some
you to understand their
foolish
point of view.
ideas people have
And you can't very
about
well
the
do
Roman
that if you're not living among them.
Judging by my analytics, if you're watching this, you're probably from a country that has had its fair share of scaremongering about immigrants. But data consistently shows that immigration is good, actually. The UN's International Organization on Migration released a report on how immigration has affected Canada positively. It shows that newcomers to Canada typically skew young, so the amount they pay into public services on average is less than what they draw from it. That's especially
All right, I'm pausing it real quick.
true for the healthcare system. They also tend to fully integrate. A third of them offer their labor as volunteers, and 2/3 join Canadian social organizations. Neato. But what about the Americans? There's plenty of anti-immigrant sentiment in Canada, absolutely, but I feel like Americans
Some
really
barbarian
need
to
an
blame,
education
some
for their benefit
outsider,
right now. A report
but also an
published in
enemy within.
2016 by the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania says, quote,
The available evidence suggests that immigration leads to more innovation, a better educated
Yeah,
workforce,
capital
greater occupational
and
specialization,
accumulation of various
better
things,
matching
and
of
then
skills with
scapegoating
jobs, and higher
outsider
overall
groups,
economic
often
productivity.
within the
Immigration
borders
also
of a
has a
given
net positive
state,
effect on combined
leads
federal,
to
state, and
stagnation.
local budgets.
It also says there isn't much evidence to support the idea that immigration lowers wages. It's not all sunbows and rainshine, though. Lower income immigrants rely more heavily on public services, which can affect lower income native born residents. But overall, it is a net positive for U.S. society. So before you show up and start ranting
Immigrants
about how
generally bring more
foreigners
people
ruined
to the
Roman
workforce.
Empire,
They do jobs
no,
that
that wasn't the case.
citizens
In fact,
of the
Roman
in-group
Empire
won't
was
do.
always made up
It
mostly of
brings,
barbarians. Rome
cheap
was just
labor,
one city,
essentially,
and even if it was a
and
pretty
various
big
other
city for
things
the time,
besides.
compared to the rest of the
Culture,
empire, it's nothing.
an increase in population.
Sometimes what causes Rome to fall.
People talk about depopulation causing the fall of Rome.
And keeping that in mind, there's Elon Musk and the anti... See if I can get it here. Elon's stupid argument.
Work on estimates of world population at various points in history, but even he admits that, quote, vast areas of world demographic history remain unknown or very certainly uncharted. There's only so much we can know about this stuff, We can see, however, that the amount
The
of
idea
land
of
cultivated
capitalism
decreased, which
as late
does
stage
suggest that the population
monopoly
decreased as well.
capitalism, as Lenin would
But
call it.
why
Everything's
is this
kind
the
of
case?
charted out at
Salvian
this
already
point, and
told
you're
us a
just
pretty
fighting
clear reason
over
why. A big portion of the
various things
population
that
lived
stagnate within
essentially at
monopolies
subsistence
that are
level,
basically
so parents
already
couldn't afford to
present
have
within
enough children to
superpowers.
offset the high mortality rate. So go figure.
But at the
For
end of the
people who
day,
barely
there
afford
can only be
rent and
one,
food, they end up
and then
having
it
fewer
dies.
children. Who could have possibly foreseen that? So Elon, if you're really that concerned about depopulation, do your part and share
The
all
usual
wealth you can
white
produce.
replacement theory. I mean, and this comes
Go
from
for it,
fascism,
man. I really
from
hope
Nazis. They would make very similar arguments.
But there's yet another factor: climate change. The modern phenomenon of climate change is largely anthropogenic. In other words, it's human activity that's causing it. It's
Yep.
our fault. And that's true. I don't want to hear any climate change denial nonsense in the comments. Shut up. Changes in how much energy we get
Well,
from
you
the
won't
sun
hear
can
it from
affect our
me. One of
climate.
my favorite
Of
books is
course,
The
that can have
History
all
of the
sorts
World
of
in
causes,
Seven
and
Cheap
we're just
Things.
one of them. Tiny variations in the Earth's orbit, meteor impacts, or volcanic eruptions that fill the air with stuff that reflects the sun energy away from us, greenhouse gases that keeps the sun energy on Earth for longer, etc. Classicist Kyle Harper argues that the rise of Rome coincided with a particularly lucky climate. They enjoyed warm, wet, and relatively stable
Oftentimes,
weather, which created the
in
perfect
Patel and Moore's
conditions for
book,
high
they talk
agricultural
about
output.
there
We've
was a
discovered
great
this
deal
as
of
a result
luck
of reading tree
that
rings and
allowed
ice
the
cores.
empire to do as
But at
well
the
as it
same
did,
time, we've
and
discovered
other
a lot of
empires that
volcanic
followed.
activity in the 530s and 540s CE. During the reign of Justinian, which was also the last time the Romans would see a period of major territorial gain. It also coincided with the first
Oftentimes, if the
outbreak
weather
of the
was
bubonic
good,
plague,
it would allow
which killed
people to
probably half the population of
harvest
the
more
Eastern Roman
food,
Empire, and I guess that's
gather
also a big
resources,
deal
prepare for
happened. Like, as
war,
bad as the
but also in times
COVID-19
of
pandemic
crisis, war
was,
would be
and
used
still
as a
is,
means of
COVID is not over.
distracting people
Imagine
from
how much
problems at
worse it would
home
have been without
as
any
a
new
result
hives or
of
vaccines,
issues
or
of
the
weather.
possibility of
So a
social
lot of these things
distancing,
would go
or
hand in
working from
hand.
home, or buying horse dewormers from naturalcovidcures.freedom.org. Who knew that climate change and a pandemic would create instability in a society? Or that climate change was linked with the debut of new pandemics? Inconceivable. If only someone had written about this back in, say, 2017, when we had a chance to do something about it. Furthermore,
Right?
archaeologist Suzanne Huckenbeck
It's a lot
and
easier
Ulf
to
Lundgren
deny and
examined
scapegoat
environmental
within
evidence,
capital
say
because it
Pompey
has
Pass, for the
to.
Huns' migration from
Capital is
their
a process
original
of
Eurasian
continual
homeland into
exploitation,
Roman territory,
and you
and
can't do
found
that
their
if you have to
migrations were
face
driven by
reality,
climate change, which
recognizing
caused
that your
drought. This
system is
caused a
dying,
massive shift for them
just as
societally,
people back in the
forcing
day
them to
couldn't
give up
imagine
their
an end to
quietness
the
for a
Roman
life full of
Empire,
extreme
and
violence.
people
Raiding
during
their
Nietzsche's
neighbors
day
for the sustenance they
imagining
could no
the
longer
death of
provide
God.
for themselves.
The same
That
idea with
brings us back to
capitalism,
invaders
just
attacking, but
another form of
once again,
empire,
it's not
but one
because
that's
they're
built on
evil demon
profit.
murder guys. They just lived in a place that was no longer habitable. So it's foolish to say population collapse of Romans over time.
I didn't have a chance to see this argument at first. No foreign policy actions can save a civilization if its population keeps dropping. Population collapse of Romans over time is what caused Rome to fall. The Romans worried about this but failed to stop it. Well, I mean,
Is what caused Rome to fall. Because even if there is a certain amount of truth to it, what caused the depopulation? Poverty among the working class, coupled with a decrease in arable land as a result of climate change. So,
the decrease
what
in
caused the
population
fall of
is
Rome, according to Salvi?
symptomatic.
The greed, vice, and selfishness of
Hmm.
the Roman ruling class.
The ruling class are the ones who have the levers of power.
Jones.
And just to pause it real quick here and state that, for instance, in feudal Europe, Patel and Moore argue that the serfs are oftentimes forced into modes of production that would make the system more unstable and thus less likely to respond positively to negative impacts from the environment. But had they had more control over what they did, they could have guaranteed better food productions and thus been less susceptible to major climate events, not just the Black Death, but the Little Ice Age and various things tied to that, that would have, they could have had a more stable system under feudalism. But because of the ruling class under feudalism did what it did, it led to the downfall of the system. Business as usual is having a system in place and then running it to the hilt, riding it hard and putting it away wet. So the critique that Sylvanus is making of the Roman aristocracy is entirely valid because it's always the fault of the rich, and then they always blame the poor.
Century historian Arnold Jones wrote a book on the later years of Rome, pointing out several factors that led to its downfall. In particular, he points out a group of freeloaders who sponged off the state and wasted its resources. Welfare
Again,
queens,
blame the
disabled
poor,
folks,
blame the
people on
welfare
forum
state, that kind of
pabulorum?
thing.
No, the group of freeloaders he specifically points out is the senatorial class. Check out this quote.
Oh,
Though numerically
bureaucracy.
small, it was immensely rich and absorbed a disproportionate share of the national income. The later emperors made little attempt to reduce the wealth of the senatorial order by special taxation.
Right. There were
And
people
weakly granted
closer to the
fiscal
middle
privileges.
class, or
They
just like
also
the
vastly
people in
increased the number
charge
of the
of
order and
operating
lavishly
the
enriched its
mechanisms of
members,
the
old
state,
and new,
increased the
by
numbers of the
allowing them to make
order, and
huge
lavishly
illicit
enriched its
profits
members
from
old
the
and new,
offices which they
by allowing
held,
them to make
and by
huge
bestowing
illicit
upon
profits
them
from the offices
extravagant
which they
gifts
held,
of gold and
similar to,
land.
say, the Soviet
The huge
Empire.
and ever-growing wealth which the aristocracy
They got it
enjoyed
from
was in
Rome.
the main derived from the estates which they inherited, bought, or received as gifts from
Where
the
is
crown,
predation taking
and was a
place?
direct charge on the peasantry.
Right?
This
Right?
is a modern historian from like 100 years ago, not an ancient source, but like, damn. Jones also
So I've
talks
never
about
seen
imperial
this, but I
bureaucrats
drew
and
the
civil
same
servants and
conclusion
a
that they're
growing
alluding to
clergy
with
in
the
the
Soviet
church, but a lot
flag.
of them took vows of poverty and worked to
And
earn a
again, the
living,
echo
so
of the
they weren't
Roman
as ideal as it
Empire,
may seem on the surface. So
the
hey, go
czars,
figure.
the
Wealth
Caesars,
consolidation in the hands of
the
fewer and more
bureaucracy that came
isolated
after the
rich weirdos
czars.
who don't produce anything doesn't actually help preserve an empire. Good thing we've learned from that, huh? Look, I know I'm being profoundly unsubtle here to the point of obnoxiousness, but look, I'm just going where the source material leads me. From what I can tell, it's a relatively uncontroversial take to say that the avarice of the ruling class of Rome was one of the most significant factors in its fall. Them's the breaks, kid. Edward Gibbon.
Yeah, and the way that history works is whatever conclusion you make based on the evidence, however absurd, must be the truth. I mean, that was Sherlock Holmes, I think. But the idea is that in Gothic stories, oftentimes there's all this illusion and the Black Veil from Radcliffe's novels, all of these things that speak to some kind of outrageous, numinous force. And yet, behind that is usually something that's relatively quotidian, right? It's an old man pretending to be a ghost, a bandit pretending to be a ghost. And if you sort of cut through the mists and you find something by following the trail of a historiography type approach, it's the same kind of idea. Instead of working with ghosts in the Gothic kind of sense, you're working with bits and pieces from history and then drawing conclusions, like Velma Dinkley pulling the mask off the Gothic villain. At the end of the day, if there's an old man behind the mask who was robbing everyone blind, then that's just what it was.
It's really impossible to talk about the historiography of the fall of Rome without talking about Edward Gibbon. His work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was really the first of its kind.
I've never heard
People
of
have
this
talked about the fall
person,
of Rome from an outsider's perspective
but I'm sure
before,
if
but
you're
he
in
was the first to
historiography, you're
really
like,
pull it
whoa,
together
Edward
into a
Gibbon.
significant and coherent
It's like the
work.
Jimi Hendrix
We
of
mentioned him briefly
historiography.
earlier. He was an Englishman in the 1700s and released his work in 6 volumes between 1776 and 1789. If you're going to build a narrative of decline, you may as well start from the highest
1789
height,
being the
and
year
that's
that
what
Anne
Gibbon
Radcliffe
does.
wrote
He
her
begins in the
first Gothic
7th
novel.
century CE,
Not her
when the
best by
empire
any stretch,
reaches its height under the reign of what we call the 5 good emperors.
but around that
Nero,
time,
Trajan,
and
Hadrian,
right around the
Antoninus
time the
Pius,
French
Marcus
Revolution would
Aurelius.
begin to
From
happen,
there, he gives a narrative of the Roman
the
world,
fear of the fall of
weaving
Rome
in
was
his ideas of
coming
what
full
caused its
circle.
decline.
And
yeah, its
the
ideas
rise
plural,
of the Gothic
because it would be
period, the
foolish to
Neo-Gothic
suggest
period
that
specifically in
moral
its
decay of
novels,
Rome would
fascination
contribute to
with
the fall
the
of a nation. Instead, moral decay
barbaric
leaves
past, a
root and
fearful
vulnerabilities
past
other
coming
threats,
back around.
both external and internal. So what are these other threats? It's worth noting that Gibbon's ideas have largely fallen out of vogue in the centuries since he wrote. That doesn't mean he was a bad scholar or anything. He was just a product of his time, and later scholarship found other, better ways to describe what he looked at. That's how scholarship works.
Yeah,
Today,
that's pretty
Gibbon's
common.
work
You
isn't
see that
really
in
worth reading as
academia
history
more
in its
broadly.
own right, but for our
You stand on the shoulders of giants
it's
and you
useful.
take their ideas and
Gibbon
you
was
find
actually
better
more
ways to
interested in
utilize
charting the
them.
history of Rome's decline
Same
and
idea
fall
with
than its
Marx.
causes, but he does still talk about the
Marx
losses,
was
otherwise
basically
we wouldn't
riffing off a
even
lot
get
of the
here.
historical
Toward the
figures
end
mentioned
of his
here,
massive
and then
work, he tells
we
us,
take Marx and
quote,
make him a bit gayer than he
After a
was,
diligent inquiry,
because he was a
I can
giant
discern
homophobe.
4 principal causes of the ruin of Rome, which continued to operate in a period of more than 1,000 years. 1. The injuries of time and nature. 2. The hostile attacks of barbarians and Christians. 3. The use and abuse of the materials. And 4. The domestic quarrels of the Romans.
He then
Makes
goes
sense.
into more detail about each. He says he thinks the main cause of Rome's fall is the fourth one, Romans'
And
propensity for
again,
civil wars, but
it was a
that can't
hypothesis,
really be
right?
attributed to
You
moral
have
decay
to
since the Romans
make
had been doing it
predictions
for
based on an
centuries.
absence of
So I'm not
knowledge
going to explore that
and
any
working
further
within
here, but
incomplete
it would be
theories.
intellectually dishonest of me not to mention it, so yeah. But because this section is about moral decay, we'll look at that. In particular, he takes umbrage with how Christianity changed the Roman state. Quote,
The statues, altars, and houses of the old gods were an abomination in the eyes of the Romans, and in the absolute command of the city, they might labor with zeal and perseverance to erase the idolatry of their ancestors. The demolition of the temples in the East affords to them an example of conduct, and to us an argument of belief, and it is probable that a portion of guilt or merit may be imputed with injustice to the Roman proselytes.
Christianity, having taken hold of the Roman Empire, began to dismantle elements of the Roman past. This was as much because of changes in morals as it was an attempt to fund their civilization. But not only is this deeply disrespectful to their own past, it's also clearly not sustainable.
Hmm.
Eventually, you'll run out of bronze tiles to strip from the Pantheon or marble slabs to strip from the Colosseum. When you break down your past to pay for your present, what happens to your future? Modern-day humans are facing that today as capitalism destroys our environment.
Similar to
At the
capitalism
same time,
eating
Christianity
itself,
is very much
Rome ate
focused on
itself.
eternal salvation based on
It
what
was
you
sort
do
of
in this
set up
life.
to do that.
According to Gibbon, this caused the Romans to focus more on policing their own actions than working toward the greater good
It
of
also
society.
was sort of the
So
death of the
main
memory of the
crux of his
people.
idea
The
that
culture
moral
that was
decline
tied to these
led
things
the
that were
fall of
being
Rome is
eaten was
Christianity.
unto itself a kind of brain
Isn't that
drain.
fun? Isn't that neato?
And then
It's worth
faced with
pointing out
like
that
a
this idea
vacuum,
is
as
no
far as
longer
that
really
goes,
considered valid.
moral panic
In
and
fact, it's
scapegoating was
really
something
easy
they
to
could
debunk.
use
If Christianity caused
through
the
a
fall of Rome,
continuous
why
transfer
did
of
the Eastern
power.
Roman Empire, a thoroughly Christian state, last for another 1,000 years? No, it's a silly idea. Christianity didn't cause the fall of Rome any more than paganism caused its rise. But if you're going to make the argument that Rome fell due to moral decay, it's important to understand what that means. So what do we have so far in terms of moral decay? The rich oppressing the poor, the government not doing anything to help the poor, and Christianity ruining Roman culture. I'm sure this is what moralizing right-wing apes mean when they talk about the idea, huh? What we've not seen so far is anybody talking about trans people. It
Right?
seems that among serious scholars of the decline of the Roman Empire, trans people weren't really considered a factor.
Right. I imagine this person is probably going to have more to say about that. And it's important, too, to consider that the idea of trans being a relatively modern term, 1965 or thereabouts, is when the modern word trans came about. And in 1870, homosexual as a word came about. But these are modern understandings of the word trans. And in the 1700s, with Gibbon, for instance, the closest you would have had is sodomy, but that doesn't even seem to come up with in his arguments. You know, he doesn't really have the language to describe that. And the persecution of trans people in a modern sense would have only just started to happen vis-a-vis someone like Matthew Lewis and Broadmoor's Camping the Canon discussing the increasing number of tribunals tied to sodomy accusations that up until that point were basically show trials that happened every once in a while, but weren't really something to take seriously until the Gothic period, the Neo Gothic period, was well underway. But certainly after that point, as Foucault would say in A History of Sexuality, the homosexual had become a separate species, one to persecute through judicial review as increasingly medicalized, and into capitalism more broadly, the rise of transphobia into the 20th and 21st centuries, which would lead to the rise of TERFs and feminism, as we know it, being fascist from the outset, basically with first wave feminism in particular, in the 20th century, mind you, second wave feminism, and basically a creating of nostalgia that would lead to people like this, I would imagine. And I just want to say before we start chapter 4 here, I don't know who this person is, but based on what I've heard of them so far in the video, just these basic quotations that are ascribing the fall of civilization, re Rome, and a fascination with transness is something of a hauntological idea, like fascism itself. It's trapped between the past and the present, retro future, right? And I have to wonder what kind of arguments they're going to make.
Camille Paglia. I'm really not looking forward to this part. The beginning of this video was even more of a preamble than usual. I know I have a tendency to be long-winded in general, but this one in
Same.
particular was more
No
because I was
judgment.
like kind of procrastinating on actually digging into this section. I don't want to do it. It's not going to be fun. I need some more wine for this.
It's not fun
All right,
looking
let's
into
take a
your
look at
own
another one of these.
conquerors.
It's a video conversation between Camille Paglia and Claire Fox from 2016. I'll link the whole thing below so you can see the details.
Basically
for
around the
yourself,
time
lest
TERFs
we
were
think I'm
rising to
misrepresenting
prominence.
the arguments made here. All right, let's get started. Free speech out loud. I swear, every single time. So after a preamble in which the
free speech
interviewer,
argument,
Claire
it's always
Fox,
one way
fangirls over
with
Paglia,
fascists.
she talks about how modern militant feminism seems to demand protection from awful things, which she feels
Like
is
trans
a
people,
massive
men in
departure
dresses,
from what feminism
vampires.
used to be. Then she asks if Paglia
A
has
better
any thoughts on
feminism.
that, and does she ever?
The British
Paglia goes
suffragettes,
on
for
an
instance.
absolute rant, ping-ponging from point to point without providing any evidence. She just keeps talking in one long, incredibly unbroken sentence, moving from topic to topic so that no one has a chance
That doesn't sound
to
like good
It's
historiography.
really quite obnoxious. The kids call it a gish gallop now, and it's a technique that's deliberately used by all sorts of right-wingers to overwhelm you with a deluge of wrong
I keep
ideas,
seeing like
so you don't even know where to start
people
your
in the
response. I'm not sure if
the
Paglia is
corner
aware
there,
that
and I
that's what she's
can't.
doing
It's
here, or
like a
if she just
subliminal
has
image.
serious ADHD and her mouth can't keep up with her thoughts. Anyway, Paglia agrees with Fox and thinks there's been a horrible regression.
But there's been a horrible regression.
She tells us she
Right, a
thinks her
regression towards a state
generation,
of
and she's a
barbarism,
boomer
which
because,
she's probably
of
going to
course she
conflate
is, has a greater
with
sense of historical reality
trans people,
because of what their parents
an ancient
experienced.
evil.
First, the Depression, then the Second World War, then they themselves lived with the fear of nuclear war. As a result, she tells us that her generation became overprotective of their children, driven by a desire to give them a better life. This gives us an interesting peek into her mindset, I think, because the word overprotective implies she thinks her generation went
Think
too
of the
far.
women and
But
children.
if that's the case, why then has she spent so much of her career railing against how queer people live our lives? This betrays a profound lack of self-awareness on her part. Perhaps, Camille, you're simply continuing the overprotective streak of your generation in the first place? From there, she describes her own childhood as being
I was in absolute open revolt against the code of a kind of simpering femininity that was being forced on us in the 1950s.
Militant feminism is often leery of a monstrous feminine.
As to say that femininity felt oppressive to her, and that she felt like she was absolutely suffocating. And I'm sure
The feminazi, acting like a man, the Amazon myth tying to a defense of the state by women acting in more masculine ways.
She always chose masculine costumes.
I mean, the performance of the myth was generally something to conquer, but there are women who unironically act like Amazons to defend the state. It's a reflection of something that the state wants women to act like, so long as they're upholding the status quo.
So far, I agree with Paglia. She found herself relating to the London youth culture in the 1960s, where she says she felt at home in the sense of rebellion and gender bending that was going on. But once she began hanging out with the second wave feminists, she felt like it had moved too far in the direction of man-bashing. While first wave feminism admired what men had accomplished and wanted a piece of the pie, second wave feminism was about hating men. And look, not to sound like a not like other girls pick me trad or whatever, but I do think feminism can occasionally go too far into the realm of man-hating. As an ex-man, I remember how alienated I felt from feminism because of things like #KillAllMen.
It's
Even
all
if I
about what you
agree
do with that.
the broader tenets of feminism.
But I
It's
will
true that
argue that,
some
it
girls
is
who thrive
possible to
on
lean
loving
too
men,
far into a
but some of the
particular
best
argument
people
to
I've
the
known
point
have
that
also
you're
been men. I've also known some
not
truly
really
honorable
productive in
non-binaries as
the
well.
thesis
But
that you're
that's
trying to tell.
getting away from the topic at hand here. I can appreciate
I
that
spent a lot of
certain
time
elements of
critiquing
second wave
TERFs,
feminism can
and
be unpalatable. You're never going to get
I'm
me
not
on
just
board
going to
with
be like, well, it's the
some
patriarchy and only the
manifesto, for
patriarchy,
example.
when examining
Yellow
tokenism,
Scum
that kind of
Manifesto,
thing.
written by Valerie Solanas, the woman who shot Andy Warhol. It's a pretty wild read. I've never read something I both agree and disagree with so profoundly. Its goals of overthrowing capitalism and patriarchy are wonderful, and so is its critique of civil disobedience as being largely ineffective in bringing about any real changes in society. But man, does she hate men. It's worth a read, though. You can find it on the Internet Archives Library for free. Anyway, I'm getting away from myself here. Can you tell I really don't want to engage with Camille Paglia's work? Why am I doing this to myself?
Sometimes
I don't have to make this video.
the
I'm not
hatred
forcing
of
it to.
men can be self-defeating,
Firstly,
right? Because
feminism
it
is
can
obviously
alienate
important.
you from
It
potential
gave
allies.
some American women the right to vote.
And
Women
it can
of color
also
wouldn't get that
give
right
the
until
enemy
much
ammunition by saying,
later.
see, look, she
But it
shot Andy
mostly focused
Warhol. Don't
on
listen to
legal
her.
inequalities.
She hates
Second-wave
men so
feminism
much
did
that she
too,
shot
but
that
also
guy.
dug more into social and cultural inequalities. Women were allowed to get jobs, sure, but
Women
they
should have
often
jobs,
didn't because
right?
the cultural expectation was for women to tend to the home and raise the kids. Now, when we divide feminism into waves, it makes it seem as though these were monolithic, unified movements with a single ideological set. That's rarely the case with ideological movements, and I think it's dangerous to think
No,
that.
I mean, if you
Instead,
look
it's
at
best to look at
TERFs
second-wave
and different
feminism for
kinds
what it
of
is.
instances
A
within
rough
that,
grouping
there's
of
so many
mostly women
branches of
who
that
shared a
alone,
belief in
just like with
progress
fascism,
for the
right?
rights of women. But within that movement, there was plenty
But
of
what is a
diversity of
woman?
thought. Some
As Matt
second-wave
Walsh would
feminists hated
famously
men,
ask.
sure. Some socialists hate gay people. Some Muslims hate black
Yep.
people. Some Zoroastrians hate Brazilians. Maybe. Okay, that one might be a stretch. But
Yeah,
plenty of
these kinds of
second-wave
things are
feminists were
modular,
married to
and
men as well.
often they
The world
overlap
isn't that
and
simple. You can't paint
combust
things with such
when they
broad
interact.
strokes like that. Anyway, Paglia seems very much to oppose what she perceives to be second-wave feminism because she thinks it's based on hating men.
Male bashing as became systemic, okay, to second wave feminism.
But here's the thing. Second-wave feminism was largely created by boomers. So, which is it, Camille? Do boomers have a greater sense of historical reality and therefore are greater thinkers? Or are second-wave feminists, who are largely boomers, ideological radicals who've built a, quote, absolute poison which has spread worldwide? Maybe she makes her views clearer in her most popular book, Sexual Personae, but I'm like 10 pages in, and there's already so much I disagree with. It's an appeal to nature over and over and over again, claiming humans are naturally hierarchical and we can't change nature. These tits on my chest say otherwise, Camille. I'm not reading the whole thing. It's like 700 pages long, and most of it won't be relevant to our discussion today. Now, it's true that there are certain elements of nature we can't change, but even there, we have deep influence over
The
it.
idea
On the
that
very
nature
first
is something
page,
that you
she
can't
tells us,
change, and hierarchy
no
is something
change
that
in
you uphold
society
generally
will
to
change
force
nature, and that's
another
simply
fascist
not
argument.
true. The Industrial Revolution was a major
There is a
societal
biological
shift
reality,
that
and
led to
anyone who goes up
significant
against that
changes
is an
in Earth's
aberration.
climate.
Trans
Unless
people.
she's arguing that society can't change the fundamental laws of nature, like gravity and electromagnetism, which, okay. But then
It's also a
later on,
deeply
she says,
dishonest way to look at
quote,
like
science
biology.
cannot avert a single
Most
thunderbolt.
nature
And
is not a binary,
yes, it
for
can.
instance.
Has this woman ever heard of a lightning rod? The CN Tower is struck by lightning an average of 75 times a year, according to its official website. If it wasn't there, that lightning would strike somewhere else, which would be less protected from it. So science does avert thunderbolts, lots of them. This is Bill Riley all over again.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Tide goes in, tide goes out.
I need to stay focused. There's so much more I could say here. There's so much more nonsense I could comment on, but that's
Fascists are like that,
today.
right?
Though
Where
might
you
be
could
able to
spend
admit that certain individual
so
feminists
much time
occasionally
studying
go too far
their wacky
into
bullshit.
hating. The more I engage with Paglia's work, the more I think she just hates women herself. Like, check this out. She claims that civilization in general was created by men to protect themselves.
There's generally
from
a
women.
deeply misogynistic
Quote,
character to people who
woman
radicalize
was an idol of belly magic. She
the way
seemed
that
to swell and give
Camille
birth by
does.
her own law. From the beginning of time, woman has seemed an uncanny being. Man honored but feared her. She was
The
black
monstrous
moth that
feminine.
had spat him forth and would devour
Barbara
him anew.
Creed.
Men bonding together invented culture as a defense against female nature. And from
It's a
this
very
defensive
Cartesian
head magic
thing.
has come the spectacular glory of male civilization,
Nature is
which
female.
has lifted woman with it.
Society is
The
male.
very language and logic modern woman uses
And
to
this comes from
assail
Enlightenment
patriarchal
thought.
culture were the invention of men. All the genres of philosophy, science, high art, athletics,
The Promethean
and
law of
politics
conflict
were
and
invented
capture.
by
Women
men.
had a right to
But
seize
by
what
the
she will.
Promethean law of conflict and capture, woman has a right to seize what she will and violate
Yeah,
man on her own terms.
demonizing Mary
Men
Shelley,
were so
basically.
scared of women that they invented culture in order to protect themselves? What a weird thing to say. It's worth noting that none of
Well,
this
it's
has any
basically
historical
parroting
basis. Like, who
Rene
invented
Descartes,
athletics? Nobody. And
Francis
serious
Bacon,
scholars on the topic will tell you it's difficult
rapists.
to even define in the first place, let alone define how it started. Classicist Nigel Crowther, under whom I had the wonderful privilege of studying during my undergrad, tells us this in his book Sport in Ancient Times, which I'll read in my best approximation of his voice. Quote,
Some see sport as a play, a part of nature, or a basic release from tension, a catharsis. Others have suggested that it arose from instinctive drives or impulses from the hunting ritual or tests of strength. Yet others have remarked on the close association.
Sport is a
between
preparation for
sport and
work that
religion
separates
in
human
the
beings
world,
from
but
beasts.
few would agree
One
that
school of
religion
thought
is the
views sport as a
origin
means
of
of
sport.
discharging aggression.
According to the Marxist theory,
Well, sports
sport's
and their
preparation
interpretation
for
as a
war
means of
separates
exercising
human
power
beings
don't
from
have a single
beasts.
interpretation.
One school
There's a
of
lot of
thought
different
views sport
mechanisms at
as a
play.
means of discharging aggression.
Gothic ludologist, babe.
Another maintains that it causes more aggression than it discharges. No
Sport
single
is clearly
theory
a
for the
social
origin of
phenomenon.
sport has been
It's a
met
huge part
with
of it,
general acceptance,
but there's
sport
obviously
is
going to be a
clearly
material
social phenomenon.
critique as well.
Athletics was invented by men, though. I've frequently seen the claim circulating that the prehistoric illustrations in the Lascaux caves in modern day France depicted sport as well, but there's only one human picture depicted in them, and it has the head of a bird. Still wonderful, not sport. Alas. Anyway, did
Real quick, before we proceed into the second half of chapter 4 here, long chapter, we have to acknowledge that Camille is basically parroting this idea of nature versus society that was coined by men hundreds of years before she was born in a panic regarding this idea of civilization in decay, needing someone to blame. Well, of course, it was women and it was nature. And, oh, you can't, second wave feminism was problematic because it hated men. And they're almost operating through this nostalgia, not just all the way back to like Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, but also just older forms of feminism that would have seen women put into a specific place where they were kind of expected to hate the rights of women insofar as you can have a piece of the pie, but only just so, while still being expected to hate your own kind. That's kind of how it plays out. It's a very shrewd, self-sacrificing, Promethean, you might say, approach to things. It's a regression, but she's pushing that off onto the people that she's blaming. Trans people were the fall of Rome. It's not her. She's not the one who's decaying. We are, apparently.
men invent athletics? That's an unprovable assertion. And of course, Palia provides no actual evidence, so we can dismiss this nonsense.
No, in order for her argument to make sense, there's some kind of like
invented language? There's absolutely no evidence for this either.
patriarchal,
Entirely
transcendental,
no language
signified.
evolved, but
You know, it's just,
there
it's
are a bunch of different
essential. It's
hypotheses for
platonic.
how it might have. One of them, proposed in 2004 by W. Tecumseh Fitch, is called the mother tongue hypothesis. Essentially, it's a theory that language began as a way for mothers to communicate with their offspring, which later extended to include other relatives and then a social group in general. I invite you to read more about it if you're interested in such things, but we won't go too much more in depth here. The point is, not only is Palia's theory that men invented language to protect themselves from women nonsensical, but another theory,
Well, yeah, it's
this
just
one from an
arbitrary.
actual evolutionary biologist,
But I would argue that it's
posits the exact
arbitrary
opposite.
in ways
Men
that
invented philosophy.
basically
Again, this
defer
is so-
to deeply
Philosophy is, at its simplest,
problematic approaches to
questioning the
science.
fundamentals of reality, and people have been doing that since the dawn of time. Some of the earliest writings we have are of this nature.
In
Even
ways
the
that ignore
Iliad, one
other
of the oldest
scientists.
pieces of writing in the Western tradition, we have Achilles' question
It's an
whether
abuse
he'll
of
be
science,
remembered
the
after
modern
death,
Prometheus.
and what sort of deeds he can do in life to assure that he is. This sort of what does it all mean questioning is at its base philosophy. But also, Plato tells us in the Symposium that Socrates was taught the philosophy of love by a woman named Diotima. And if we consider, as many do,
Didn't Socrates
that
compare his
Socrates
wife
is
to
one
a
of the
horse?
most important figures in the history of Western philosophy, his wisdom came in part from at least one woman. So
Wasn't
this is
Aristotle
nonsense.
ridden by an
He
ass?
invented art? No.
Or
Art
ridden like an
also
ass
predates writing. Some
by
of the oldest
a woman,
examples of human
Phyllis?
art in the Western
That
tradition
was the
come
topos
from
of
the
power of
Lascaux
women,
caves
and
in
it
France,
arose
which
in the
we
medieval
mentioned a moment
period.
ago.
But
Let's come
I
back
don't
to
think
them.
that actually
They're just
happened
such
historically,
beautiful,
but
incredible
it's fun to think
things.
about.
They're around 17,000 years old and are considered among the oldest depictions of
I will say
humans
that
interacting with women
patriarchy,
around
more
them in
broadly,
visual
tends to
media.
erase
We've
women's
got
view of
bison,
things,
horses,
and that under
elephants,
Cartesian thought
deer,
moving
bears,
forwards,
a bird guy,
nature
and a bunch
becomes
more. It's
female,
so damn cool.
gynecological
Who
from
made
the
them?
outset, as Patel
We
and Moore
don't
put
know.
it.
It's not like there's any like signatures.
But
on
there's
the
so
photos
much
or
that
anything.
isn't known
We
of
do know
history
they were
from that
layered on
period,
top of one another.
and
However,
history is
which
written by the
suggests they were
conquerors
placed
in ways
earlier
that tend
depictions
to
over
exclude
time.
women
It was
who don't
probably a
conform.
multi-generational effort as a result.
From the ancient
And
period
if
and
we
the
go
prostitution
outside
of
the
women
West, we can
into
find stuff a lot older. Back in
Athens and
2021, they found a painting
second-class
of a pig
citizens,
on Sulawesi, one
into
of the main islands of Indonesia. It dates to at
Hammer of
least
Witches in the medieval period, for
45,500
instance. There's
years
so
ago,
many
more than
examples of that.
twice as old
This
as the
is,
Lascaux caves.
from Camille's
Incredible.
case, a defense
What
mechanism,
was
you
the
could
gender of the
argue.
people who created these? There's no way of knowing. But if you want to push
Oftentimes,
a
women who
misogynist
become
agenda,
cops
you
are
could simply
doing so
claim it was men with
through a
Millennials in
fear
the
of
future. I
abuse
could go into
and
detail on
a
the other
armed
things here Polly
subservience
claims
or
were
a
invented by men, but really she
deferral
provides
to
no evidence
authority.
for any of it. And logically speaking, assertions made without evidence can be
No, it's not a
discarded without
logical
evidence.
position. It's
Well,
it's a
we don't
position
live
of
in a logical
survival that
world,
is
do we?
generally
So I wanted to provide at least
subjugated.
some information here to
Men
help
are
you
in
see that
charge
this is
because they were always in
pure
charge.
ahistorical nonsense. Palia presents women as a passive
It's
beneficiary
ahistorical
of it,
nonsense that
simply
doesn't
along for
utilize
ride
the
as men do
poetry
at heart,
of
not providing
monsters
any value beyond
to do
procreation.
anything
I was
but
in
maintain the
absolute
status
open
quo.
revolt against the code of a
She
kind of
is a
simpering
defender of
femininity that was
empire
being forced
and
on us in
invents
the 1950s.
various
What's so
myths
cynical
accordingly.
about that? So much of Palia's work seems to be built on making an assertion without proof and then moving on before we have a chance to question it. Let's get back to the video. Fox tries to
She
bring the
sounds awful.
conversation back on topic by asking about what she calls, quote, Generation Snowflake. And wow, it's been a while since I've engaged in peak boomer bullshit like this. Anyway, she asks basically the same question again. At 10 minutes, 5 seconds, she asks,
Isn't the point about women's liberation to be free and strong,
Yes.
to take risks, rather than the I can't cope with that. If I see a picture, it's going to finish me off, and who can protect me?
Palia sees this as a return to the enforced femininity of the 1950s. Millennials are demanding protection because
It's because nothing has really happened.
What, because
in
we
this
have
generation.
boundaries?
We've not had that,
You're not
initial
strong enough. You
experience that
need
my
to
generation
be
did
tough.
Of war.
It's
What
a very
experience of war
particular
are you
kind of
talking
approach,
about, Camille?
acting like a
Earlier,
man.
You said boomers had a greater sense of historical reality because you heard stories of war from your parents. What experience of war did your generation have? Korea and Vietnam, maybe? Okay, I'll give you that. But millennials had Iraq and Afghanistan. We also had to deal with the Great Recession of 2008, while her generation enjoyed a relatively strong economy throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Bretton
Anyway,
Woods,
I'm gonna move
yeah.
on from this section because my goal is to debunk the idea that trans people caused the fall of Rome, not to debunk boomer bullshit. Besides, she keeps characterizing millennials in a way that's completely out of touch with reality. Well, this is exciting. I
Well, she
actually
has
haven't been
to.
able use
She
this
needs
one.
someone to scapegoat, blame the young. It's something that's happened since Plato. It's the Utes.
I do agree with one thing she says, though. Ancient history must be taught. But in particular, she insists on teaching young people about the disasters of history. Again, I agree, but what are these historical disasters?
Fall of
I
Rome.
don't know for a while yet. But anyway, before we get to the bit about trans people causing the fall of Rome, she addresses such important hot button issues as second wave feminism is exposing young women to danger because psychotic males are
I think it's
picking up
wild,
prey.
you know,
Quote,
blaming
"The
second
male
wave
gaze
feminism
is a
when I'm
prop.
so
Women
used
who
to
dress provocatively are, quote,
dealing with second wave
advertising, and if you're
feminism as
advertising,
like
be
the
ready to
enemy
sell.
of trans
Women who
people,
go
and
on
here
dates
she
with men
is
should accept
blaming
the
it.
responsibility
So she's
for the
like
sex that comes along with
even
it, and
more
that, quote,
regressive than a lot
date
of
rape
TERFs are.
is a distortion
Or
of
like
our
sharing,
feelings.
again,
She
that
also
idea
goes
that
a
like
lot
feminism
further
and
into rape
fascism,
culture denial,
it's not
which,
this neat
as a
cut and
survivor
dry
myself,
thing.
I really don't want to continue engaging with. All right, At about 36 minutes into this damn thing, they finally start to address gender. Fox starts off by talking about how, as a kid, it seemed unfair to her that all the traditionally masculine virtues like intellect, bravery, and leadership were seen as good things. Meanwhile, all the feminine ones were simpering and hopeless. And yeah, I agree. One of
Yeah,
the reasons why
that's
Princess
fair.
Leia is so beloved is that she's not the boring old damsel in distress type. She
She's
does need to be
active.
rescued, true, but then
Amazonian.
immediately she rescues Han, Luke, and Chewie. She's an intelligent, courageous leader who just happens to be a pretty lady as well. So I agree. But then she says,
But there is something weird, despite that, about the transgender question.
oh, one hell of a segue there. That might not sound like there's anything explicitly hateful about framing it as the transgender question on the surface, but this is clearly
I mean,
echoing
the
a Jewish
question is
question,
usually
which was
yeah,
an ongoing
right?
conversation
The Jewish
about what
question.
was appropriate to do with the Jewish population of Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The rhetoric
It's
escalated
essentially a
over time,
continuation of
with
blood
Bauer
libel through
arguing in
sodomy
his
arguments that
1843 book, The Jewish
you're
Question,
posing
that
the
Jews
question
couldn't
so
be
that you can
emancipated
enact
in
a
a full
culling
part of
by
European
blaming
society
someone for
unless
the
they
fall of
gave up their religious
civilization.
convictions, because a free and emancipated nation required the abolishing of religion. This was countered the following year by none other than Karl Marx, who said that abolishing religion was not a requirement for political emancipation. I know that's a massive oversimplification of both works, I'm sorry. Anyway, it continued back and forth over the years with many different groups
Well,
chiming
that's how it
in,
works when
but
you're
eventually
summarizing
the ruling
books,
party
if
of
you have to
Germany
explain them in a
believed the very
sentence.
existence of Jews within its state was a threat. They introduced heavier and more draconian measures in
Same
response
idea,
to
right? Blame
the
the
Jewish
poor,
question,
Salvinius.
until
Now
eventually they
blame the
decided
Jews.
on their
It's
final
not so different
solution
from what happened
to
to
the
them
Jewish
before.
question. Or
It's a
just the
reoccurring
final
theme.
solution. Am I saying that Claire Fox is aligned with
Find a
Nazis?
minority,
No, I am saying,
generally
however,
one that's
that
been
she was a member of the
continuously
Brexit
exploited,
Party, opposes
and
multiculturalism, and was
punish them.
appointed to the UK House of Lords by Boris Johnson. Ironically, her official portrait mirrors how I felt while engaging in this trash. She did, however, vote against designating Palestine Action as a terrorist organization, so credit where credit is due, I guess. Anyway, it's possible
Broken
that her
clock.
framing this as the transgender question is just another innocent flub or a use of the term without really understanding what it means. I want to do my best to be charitable here, but considering how many awful things have been said in this conversation so far, and how many awful things have come up as I looked into her on even a surface level, it's hard to give her the benefit of the doubt here. Anyway,
Don't.
she says there's something else going on than just the liberation of gender fluidity, which Palia herself celebrated earlier in the conversation. It's going too far, apparently. People are seeking surgical interventions, and if anyone speaks out about it and says the wrong thing, they're lambasted for it in the media. How does Palia respond to this? She says
Free
that as
speech,
soon as
right?
you
We
feel
just want to critique
dissatisfied with
trans
the
people.
limitations of your
We
gender,
just want to ask
there's an enormous
questions.
mechanism in place to help you halt puberty and transition. This is at best a gross oversimplification of the reality of gaining access to transition-related care. Even back
Well, it's
in
also important to
2016, when this
recognize
video was
that
originally made, it was nowhere near that
puberty
easy.
blockers were
She also
administered
says
historically
that
to assist
transition
people.
opens one door and closes many others. And
So inventing
yeah,
this issue and then
oh
pinning
shit,
it all on
that's the
trans people when
point.
the
It closed the
medication
door
wasn't
on being a man,
originally meant
but
for
also
them,
closed the door on the possibility
it's
of being a father,
Darvo.
a boyfriend, a husband, and so on. But look, I wanted to close those doors, so I closed them. This is true of every decision that we make in our lives, though, right? Etymologically, decision comes from the Latin decidere, which is a combination of de, from, and caedere, to cut. So literally it means to cut from. When you make a decision, you cut off other possibilities. That's the point. Like, imagine you're getting toward the end of your high school career and you're deciding what you want to study in post-secondary. You've narrowed it down to two choices. You want to be either a plumber or an electrician. After a while, you decide to go to plumbing school, and as a result, you close the door
I'm just quiet
on
because I'm
being an
trying to
electrician. You
understand the
also close
point
the door on
they're
your being a
getting at here.
psychologist, or a dock worker, or an astrophysicist, or an elevator repair person, or a baker, or a vending machine operator, or a software developer. Or is that bad? No. The world needs plumbers. Closing doors is not inherently bad.
Reminds me of
But
the
what
Breakfast
about
Club.
the children?
Without
It's always about
lamps, there would be no
protecting
light.
these people, isn't it? She says anyone who allows a minor to transition and helps them to do so is guilty of child abuse, a crime against humanity. They should wait until they're the age of majority to have
So
access
she's a
to
turf.
gender reassignment surgery. But that's already the case. The World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare, or WPATH, creates their recommended guidelines for the care of transgender people. The current version of their standards is version 8, but in 2016, when the video I'm commenting on was recorded, it was version 7. So let's take a look at that one. In order to qualify for gender reassignment surgeries in 2016, WPATH recommended that people be of the age of majority in their country. That includes both top and bottom
So she's
surgery,
saying that you need
regardless of what
something,
direction you're going in
but it
your
already
transition.
exists, so
Now,
she's
whether or not
ignoring
they
that.
agree
She
with these
doesn't
guidelines is
she
irrelevant
doesn't care
here.
if it actually
The
exists or
point
not.
is, Palia is ranting about something she doesn't understand.
hmm
She's making something up and getting mad about it. And that's
Yeah. Yeah, the
so
facts don't
typical
matter.
of right wingers, isn't it? They're entirely led by their emotions. They just get angry about stuff. And they don't even bother to find out whether or not it's true. Unbelievable. But it's also pretty rich to hear her accusing healthcare providers of child abuse when she herself has defended child abuse on multiple occasions. If you're sensitive to this sort of thing, I recommend you skip the next little bit. I'll leave a timestamp below to show you where to skip forward to. In an interview with
All right, so I just want to say this part includes triggering stuff supposedly tied to child abuse. So not only am I a survivor of rape, but I'm also a survivor of child abuse. So it's pretty hard to trigger me just because I've spent so much time discussing this kind of stuff. I've been in and out of therapy my whole life. My books and writing them was therapeutic, but just something to keep in mind, I guess, as we listen to this part.
TVO's Danielle Richler, she talks about how much she hates, well, a lot of people. But in particular, she really seemed to hate Sinead O'Connor. In response to a
How
conversation,
could you hate Sinead?
Sinead O'Connor famously tearing up a photo of the Pope in protest of child abuse in the Catholic Church on television, she said,
And she got
and I
banned from
quote,
In the case
SNL.
of Sinead O'Connor, child abuse was
What?
justified.
Get
now,
fucked.
that's a horrible thing to say, no matter who you are. But you might think she said it jokingly and just has a sick sense of humor or something. But she actually has a long history of defending child abuse in general. And
Right.
PDF
The more
files
radical
in
the
particular,
feminism,
because it
in a
always
fascist
comes
kind of
back to
way,
this, doesn't it?
they will
And especially
defend
for
child
someone,
abuse
she
because
says
it
the
comes
following.
from a
I'm going
patriarchal
to use
force.
the AI voice here, and I'm sorry for that. I know nobody likes using AI, but there is no way in hell you'll catch me reading this aloud in my own voice, and when you hear it, I'm sure you'll understand.
These days, especially in America, love is not only scandalous and criminal, but somehow in bad taste. On the evening news, one sees handcuffed teachers, priests, and Boy Scout leaders hustled into police vans. Therapists call them maladjusted, emotionally immature. But beauty has its own laws, inconsistent with Christian morality. As a woman, I feel free to protest that men today are pilloried for something that was rational and honorable in Greece at the height of its civilization.
This is all just so disgusting, and I really don't want to dig into it any further, but here are a few quick points. On the 19th of September 1991, she gave a talk at MIT where she defended herself against accusations that she's a neocon, where she said, quote,
Now, when people call me a neocon, what kind of idiots are they? I'm someone who is on the record as being pro-pornography all the way through KI, porn and stuff films.
A couple of years after that, she published Vamps and Tramps, a collection of
fuck?
essays. In that, she tells us how proud she is of inspiring the PDF community. Quote,
I have been thanked for my views by many men, by letter and in person after lectures, because of their own adolescent liaisons with
None of
supportive
this
guides.
is,
At
it's
many points,
shocking,
I
but it's
became
not like
aware of the private
surprising.
connection
You know,
between
it's
the
like, well,
genuine
yeah,
poet
she's so
and the good-looking
nostalgic for a
local
time
genius
where
early teens.
men rule
It was
the
against
world.
law, but I saw nothing wrong with it.
She's,
these
it's
are all her own
Pygmalion
words,
syndrome,
and they've
right?
been published.
She's
Like, you can find them yourself. This
like
woman
an
is
obedient golem. She's
absolutely
made in the
impossible to
image of
defend
what
unless you
an
too
obedient
are
girl
sick.
should be,
And
daddy's
she has the
girl.
nerve to accuse others of child abuse when she herself is a proud supporter of child abuse. Of course, she's found a
Well,
home
yeah,
in
it's
the world of
boundaries for me, not for
hence,
these.
she's been favorably interviewed or
Anything goes for
recommended
her.
by
She can
sexual
say whatever she
luminaries
wants to
at
maintain the
Carlson,
status
Jordan
quo.
Peterson, Breitbart, and the Daily Wire. Because of course she is.
Ah, this is so
Camille
weird.
Paglia on trans people causing the fall of Rome. When did we get to the part where transgenders cause societal collapse? At
Like,
4
this is a
minutes
very
and 30
radical,
seconds into
like,
it. After she
there's
drops
serfs
a
that
weapons
are generally
bombshell,
steeped
she
in the
tells us,
language of
quote,
second
More
wave
on forward,
feminism, but
I
this
realize
is
that historically, the movement
like
toward androgyny occurs in
an
late
even
phases
more
of culture,
regressive form of
okay?
that, like just an
As a
openly
civilization
fash.
is starting to unravel, okay, and you can
sort
find
of
it again
language
and
that's
again and again
nostalgic
through history. In
for
the Greek art, you can see it happening all of a
the
sudden.
glory of
Sculptures depict
Rome.
young men who used to be very
Women
robust in
that
the
do
archaic period
apologize for
suddenly
child
began to
abuse
seem like
because
wet
the
noodles
father
toward the
does
end.
it,
And the
the
people who live
husband.
in such periods, a late phase of culture, whether it's the Hellenistic era, whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it's the mauve decade of Oscar Wilde in the 1890s. Whether
This
it's
reminds me of
modern
C.S.
Europe,
Lewis when he
people who
talks
lived in such
about
times feel like they were very
a
sophisticated, yet
cheatable
very
paradise
simple.
versus Dante's
Homosexuality,
Angels,
heterosexuality, so
and
what?
the lack of something
Anything
sort of
goes,
numinous or
and so on.
fearsome replaced with something
But from the
feminine
perspective of
and
historical
soft.
distance, you can see
The
that it's a
sexism
culture
takes
that
a
no
lot of
longer
different
believes in
forms
itself.
depending on the
And what you invariably get are people who are convinced of the power of heroic masculinity on the edges of society.
material
Whether they were
being
the Vandals or the
discussed.
Huns or the barbarians of ISIS, you see them starting to mass on the outside of the culture, and that's what we have right now, a rather terrifying disconnect between the infatuation with the transgender movement in our own culture, and what's going on out there. That's why I'm concerned. I feel it's ominous. I question whether the
Is
transgender
it
choice is
genuine in
indeed
every
genuine
single
in every single
case?
case, but what concerns me is when well-meaning adults believe that they are helping people by making some permanent change in the body from which there is no going back.
What evidence does she provide for
Scaremongering.
this? None.
She doesn't
So
have
it's up
to.
to us
It's a
then.
moral
What does
panic.
she mean by a late phase of culture? I don't know. What we call the later Roman Empire.
There's a
is
problem when
historical
you're on the
invention that
cusp of
helps
some
discuss
kind of
the era's
abyss,
political realities.
and
We
you
talked
have to
about that
find someone
already.
to blame.
But as we've also
And
talked about
she's, again,
exhaustively,
it
there's
hasn't really
no
come up in the
formal
video,
date
but
for the
she's
end of the Roman Empire. And even if there
right. It's an
were, the Romans
apocalypse.
themselves
You're
knew
predicting the
all
end of the world in a very
continued.
cult-like
And she
way.
specifically
And
refers
she,
to the later
as someone
phase of
who's making the
cultures,
prediction, is
not of
essentially
political
a
entities.
facilitator
The
of
culture in
cult-like
Italy in
behaviors.
477 CE wouldn't
She's
have been
profiting
much
off
different
this.
from that
And
of
that's something that
476, but in
I wonder if
576 it
she's,
would have changed quite a bit. But then again,
if
it
Sophie's
also
going
would
to
have looked
talk about
different in
that
376 because
towards the end,
cultures change.
like
Go look up a
in
photo
chapter
of our
5
city
maybe.
from 100 years ago. If
How
your
is she
city is any old,
profiting?
and you'll see how different it looks. Here's Toronto in 1927. It's pretty awesome, but it doesn't look much like today. Culture changes over time. That's how culture works. People have new ideas sometimes. Montesquieu even tells us the Romans' ability to adapt to new ideas is what made them so dominant in the first place. Quote,
And it should be noted that the main reason for the Romans becoming masters of the world was that, having fought successfully against all peoples, they always gave up their own practices as soon as they found better ones.
eventually, Roman culture would evolve into medieval European cultures, French, Burgundian, Slavic, etc. But those cultures evolved from Roman culture, along with a mix of other influences along the way. Those then evolved into the various cultures of colonial era Europe, French, British, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, which they exported around the world, usually through the barrel of a gun. So what's the late phase of Roman culture? Arguably, we're in it. We also sometimes
Right,
use
yeah.
the
I mean,
late
capitalism
phase
is
of a culture
built on the
to
Roman
mark periods
Empire.
of significant innovation. For example, the Neolithic period in Mesopotamia was the late phase of the Stone Age, and it began when people learned to make pottery. That might not sound like a big deal today, but for a Stone Age person, it's incredible. You can cook with it, you can store food and drinks in it, you can ferment stuff in it, you can keep vermin away from it more easily, and so much more. It's also often a culture's first foray into creating decorative objects. So in that case, the late phase of the Neolithic was a good thing. But that doesn't seem to be what she's talking about here. She tells us it's a sign of a culture that no longer believes
A
in
fear of
itself.
change,
Now, I think a lot
a
of us
fear
have
of
good reason to no longer
becoming
believe in
something
modern culture
different.
as it is, but
It's
let's
capitalist
put
realism.
that aside. Broadly speaking, we divide ancient Greek sculpture into three different eras: archaic, classical, and Hellenistic. It is true that archaic Mediterranean sculpture often depicts figures that are quite masculine. Take a look at these kouroi, for example. We looked at these in the Bearded Venus video. They're statues of young men that are always in the same pose, and they show up all over the archaic Mediterranean. The techniques they use were cruder, but the depiction is there. But there are plenty of Hellenistic sculptures that are just as masculine. This famous statue of Laocoon and his sons being attacked by serpents is a great example. We found it in Italy, but it was probably made by Greek artists from Rhodes and is absolutely in the Hellenistic style. It's one of the most striking statues I've ever seen, and it's hard to argue that Laocoon is depicted androgynously here. Here's another one, the Farnese Heracles. It's also from Italy from the 3rd century CE, but it's a copy of a much older Greek original from probably the 4th century BCE. And again, masculine as hell. If you've ever
Mhm.
been on Grindr before, you've seen this guy. Here's the Gigantomachus from Pergamon on the west coast of Asia Minor. It was sculpted sometime in the 2nd century BCE as part of a gigantic altar. What do you see here? Manly men with manly beards fighting other manly men. Yeah, there's a couple of clean-shaven gods and women as well, but that doesn't negate the clear depictions of masculinity here. Was there some Hellenistic art that was androgynous? Yeah, of course there was. But there is also androgynous archaic art. We looked at a bunch of it in the Bearded Venus video, and that's only what we found on Cyprus. There's a whole lot more that we just haven't gotten a chance to get into yet. But if you cherry pick what you want to show, you can
Mhm.
construct a narrative that fits more easily with your agenda.
You
Now,
present
she
the
also
past
presents
as
the Hellenistic era
masculine,
as a period
essentially
associated
masculine,
with
and
decline
under
and
attack by degenerate,
literally
monstrous
the
feminine
opposite is
forces.
true. The Hellenistic era is the period following Alexander's conquests, when successor states emerged and fought over his empire. It was ancient Greece at its political and cultural peak. Inarguably, Greek culture spread far from its source, influencing the evolution of art and culture as far as India. The sculptures we looked at a moment ago were in a Hellenistic style. It's when artists in the Western tradition first learned to express human emotion deeply through their work. You feel sympathy for these
I
blocks
keep
of stone.
getting
You
quiet
see
because
every
they're
muscle
teaching me so
intricately
much stuff.
carved.
I'm
It's
almost getting
beautiful
overloaded
stuff.
at
The
this
Hellenistic
point,
era also saw the
which wouldn't
birth of
really be a
static
problem
and
if I was
Epicurean
just
philosophies.
absorbing it, but I'm also
Skepticism
trying to
too.
respond to it.
Not YouTube skepticism. The amazing atheist isn't that old. What about science? Eratosthenes figured out the Earth was round during the Hellenistic Age, and he calculated pretty closely its circumference as well. The Antikythera mechanism comes from the Hellenistic Age, which calculates the movements of celestial bodies. Euclid wrote his mathematical works. Archimedes calculated the value of pi. Hipparchus invented trigonometry. The Great Library of Alexandria was built during the Hellenistic Age for Zeus's sake. Do declining cultures build great libraries? I don't think so. And it was not the only major library. I could go on for a while.
The
here,
idea
but
of a
I think
decline
the
is something that you
Hellenistic era
posit
was a
to set
culture in
up
decline
a
is
fault,
once
a
again
scapegoat.
pure ahistorical nonsense. But what is she basing this idea on? It seems she associates the late phase of a culture with decadence. What's decadence? When writing about the writer
Decadence.
Charles
Yeah.
Baudelaire, Paul
That old
Bourget gives us the
chestnut.
following definition of decadence. Quote,
The state of a society which produces too small a number of individuals for the work of community life.
that seems a little too simplistic, though, a little too straightforward. Almost as though it's a tangible, measurable trait. Like, we can tell a society has entered a decadent state just as readily as we can tell when a liquid has entered a gaseous state.
I remember
It's not a
watching
measurable
The
trait, it's a
Terror,
moral
and they have the
trait,
fall
you
of
see.
Rome, but it's
Is
led
the
up
later Roman
to
Empire
with this
decadent?
like
If you
decadent
believe the Romans
party,
themselves, yes,
and then
but
after
was
that
always the case.
decadence,
In fact, so
they
much of
basically
the Roman
burn down their
modern tradition
encampment
is just
and
a
are forced to
centuries-long
subsist
game
in
of
the snowy
colonial
ruins
days.
around their
Titus Livius, or
beached
just Livy,
ship.
was a historian who wrote during
So
the reign
again,
of
it's
Augustus,
it's
the
it's
first
an
emperor.
argument
We've
that
talked about
is
him a bunch of times before.
just sort of
Cornelius
forced upon
Antiochus,
readers.
Venus, the
This is a
Gallic Wave, and
given,
so
and you
on.
just
We
have to
even
take it at
mentioned
face
him at the
value,
beginning
a
of this video.
priori,
He wrote an enormous work
outside of
150
experience,
volumes
and then from
covering the
there,
history of
you
Rome
can
from its
force
founding.
your scapegoat argument
Unfortunately,
onto
only
people.
35 of them survive today.
It's a scam.
And what we have is practically dripping with morality. He begins his work by saying that while other histories tend to rush through the oldest stuff in order to get to the contemporary era, he's more interested in staying in the earliest era. He tells us, quote,
I shall find antiquity a rewarding study, if only because while I am absorbed in it, I shall be able to turn my eyes from the troubles which for so
Reminds me
long
of
have
Horace
tormented the
Walpole,
modern world.
the invention of an imaginary
Relatable.
barbaric
That's half the reason why
to
some
avoid
call
being around
Machiavelli is
Parliament.
sure, but shortly after that, he tells us about his moral crusade. Quote,
I invite the reader's attention to the much more serious
The
consideration
truth of the world as we know it
ancestors
through the
made,
wisdom
of
of the
who were
past
men,
is something that is
and what the
conjured up
means, both in
in a
politics and
neo-Gothic
war,
kind of way.
by which Rome's power
And
was
as
first
historians,
acquired
if
and
you
subsequently
exist
displayed.
among, say,
I would then
the
have
ancient
them trace the
past,
process of
there is a
growth,
degree of
to
imagination
watch
that goes
first
into
the
it,
sinking
a degree of
the foundation
invention.
morality
It's
as the
not so
old
clear
teaching
cut.
was allowed
You're
to
working with
lapse,
something that's
then the
shadowy.
rapidly increasing disintegration, then the final collapse of the whole edifice, and then the dark dawning of our modern day, when we can neither endure our vices nor face the remedies needed to cure them.
Rome is falling. We must save our civilization from moral decay and decadence. The only way is to buy my supplements. Use the code INVICTUS14 and subscribe to infobelly.com.
Oh, except now InfoWars is owned by The
Pretty
Onion.
clearly ties the greatness of the past to Rome's military might, and he sees his era as a time of decay from that greatness. Now, for no particular reason, this is a map of the Roman state just before Livy was born during the Mithridatic Wars. He was born in either 64 or 59, we're not sure which. Here's another map of the Roman state shortly before Livy died in 14 CE. When he wrote the above bit, it would have been just a bit smaller than this. And here's a map of Rome at its height, just over 100 years later. Do you notice something? No? Yeah, me either. After all, empires in decline double in size and sustain that growth for centuries all the time, don't they? Now, there's more to Livy's moralizing tendencies than territorial gains. I'm kind of
Again, it's a cult argument. It's not based on historical facts or realities, but the world is ending quick. We need to punish someone. It's a means of exploiting workers, generally from someone who's closer to the in-group than not.
I think we can assume he'd make that pretty clear. So, does he? No, he doesn't. He's much more interested in the heroism, piety, and familial loyalty.
And a lot of these things I'm actually referring to Camille,
in
not
fact, when he tells us about how Cybele first arrived in Rome, he only makes a
not the
brief
historian
casual
that
mention of Greece, the Galli, accompanying
Sophie's
it. He
discussing
doesn't
at the
comment
moment,
on their
Livy.
appearance, their mannerisms, their effeminacy, or anything of the sort. He just says they were there and moves on. Livy, the great moralizer of Roman history, was a trans ally. Go figure. Shortly before Livy, we have Gaius Sallustius Crispus, or just Sallust. He was born in the 80s BCE, probably 86, and died in 35 or 34 BCE. That means he would have been dead before Livy began writing his own works. He was a senator and an ally of the First Triumvirate.
I will say, watching this, that there's just so much history to go over. But in analyzing that, a good historian will find threads that, through historical accuracy and good argument, can help us come up with arguments of trans allyship were not the cause of the end of the world.
Anyway, he retired from
And oftentimes we have to do it out of necessity because we're facing whack jobs like Camille Haglia,
we have Bellum Catilinae about
who's
Catiline's attempt to overthrow the Roman Republic.
reactionary
in
as hell.
63 BC. We also have Bellum Jugurthinum about the war between Rome and the Numidian kingdom under Jugurtha. He probably did know a bit more about this one since he was governor of the former Numidian territory that became a part of Rome. Spoiler alert. We also know he wrote another work, Historiae, which covers the period from 78 to 67 BCE, but we only have some small fragments of it, unfortunately. His work, too, involves a lot of moralizing. Scholar Brian Matthew Mumper wrote his PhD dissertation on the topic.
Matthew
In it,
Mumper.
he describes the nature of Sallust's moralizing and his pessimism. Some scholars think it's similar to Livy's, that he viewed the past as a much nobler, more dignified, and more honorable time, and his own era as one of decadence and decline. But others think he was always pessimistic and assumed the Romans would cycle back and forth between vice and harmony, or discordia and concordia.
Boomer
Did
bust
Sallust talk about
and
trans people as a
capitalism.
force that drew the Roman world toward discordia? He doesn't seem to. I found no mention of the Galli, of Cybele, of homosexuality, of Kinaidi, of Hetairai, or of any of the old moral yarns we often see from conservatives these days. A key turning point, according to Sallust, seemed to be the year 146 BCE, when Carthage was finally destroyed. With it came a great influx of wealth into the Roman state, which led to greater corruption and more laziness. More money, more problems. Again, not trans people. Now, Camille Paglia seems to think trans people make
Yeah, it
culture
seems to be a
effeminate,
distinct lack
which
of
leads to
trans
stronger
people in regards to
masculine
the
cultures conquering
the
them.
downfall of
That's
Rome.
also nonsense. The presence of femininity in people of any gender
But
doesn't
in
negate
search
masculinity,
of a
and if
scapegoat,
trans people are assigned
Camille
roles
has to
for
come up with
becoming
something.
effeminate and weak, how does she explain trans men? Transphobes usually
Right.
forget trans men exist. Look, I could go on,
Yep.
but this is long enough. I really didn't plan on making this video.
Trans
this
women are
long.
generally the
The point is,
scapegoats.
Camille Paglia's little rant here is
It's not to say that
pure
trans men aren't
nonsense.
scapegoated too, but trans
What's she
women are
talking about?
the
I don't know.
vampires,
Your guess is
the
as good as mine.
penetrators.
But in terms of trans people being linked to cultural collapse, there's no evidence of that. Camille Paglia is just saying stuff.
Yeah.
Chapter 5. What does all this tell us?
Yeah, and again, I've been relatively quiet just because I'm sort of trying to absorb, like, oh, there's all this stuff, all these historians I've never heard of before, and basically pointing out that, well, yeah, look at all this history and look at trans people and their actual place in history and people talking about them and moralizing and states of order and discord. And do trans people actually factor that much into it? vis-a-vis a so-called fall of Rome according to historiography. And according to Sophie, someone who studies transgender history within the ancient world, alongside our own, that doesn't seem to be the case. Camille's just saying stuff. And I would agree. I'm like, yeah, it's like Hitler, right? When Hitler's calling for the scapegoating of Jewish people and blood libel and the reviving of various practices that would see Jewish people persecuted because the state is in crisis and failing and they need to come up with something. They're inventing an enemy and they're inventing history to go along with it. It's just gibberish, but it may be founded on some degree of grievance, but at the end of the day, it's coming from a position of relative privilege of the middle class through a false rebellion vis-a-vis Michael Parenti is defending the status quo. But generally that's done through a great deal of bad history, a great deal of invention. That idea of the Gothic, right? The myth of Gothic ancestry endured because it was useful. And that another Gothic scholar whose name is escaping me at the moment, Mark Madoff, 1979. The power of invention can be used by reactionaries to invent whatever enemy they need. By forging history as they see fit, they don't have to refer to actual historical documents. They can just come up with their own stuff. The same way that you might take Vlad the Impaler and invent Dracula to demonize them and maintain the status quo as it exists presently. After him, you can take and manipulate history to punish people who are alive currently. You don't just have to attack dead people. You can say, hey, trans people are a threat, and then use that to persecute people presently to basically enact capitalism in decline. That's what fascism is. It's a form of capitalism. And you're exploiting the poor, just like Sophie has pointed out. And that's basically what Camille's doing. She's through like Pygmalion syndrome, is basically under the influence of this imaginary Roman space that she's regressed to and sees trans people as tied to this fall that she wants to manifest so she can exploit people and benefit from them being exploited. She's a taskmaster. All right, this is the last part of the video here. Let's see how it closes out. What does all this tell us?
So let's recap. When did Rome fall? It's complicated and there's no single straightforward answer. What did
Certainly
the fall
not
of
trans
Rome look
people.
like? It's complicated and there's no single straightforward answer. What caused the fall of Rome? It's complicated and there's no single straightforward answer.
And of course, Camille's providing a very simple sort of explanation. It's trans people. Super obvious. It's a simple explanation to a complex problem.
Happen to be transphobic, and there are plenty of transphobic classicists out there, I'm sure. So where does this idea come from?
But that's
Why
not what
do
Camille's
people
referring
think
to,
trans
right?
people caused the fall of Rome? The best explanation I can find is that people saw writers who talked about moral decay causing the fall of Rome, and rather than learning what those writers meant by the term, they used it to confirm their own moral biases.
Yeah.
It's a simple explanation for
Homophobia.
this topic. I haven't found a better way to
And
make
that's also
sense of this
tied to
moment
socialism
progress
and Western Marxism, for that
how it
matter.
worked. The ancient
See it with
Mediterranean
Stalin,
was
right?
Such a wonderful period of history, spanning thousands of years and dozens
Degeneracy
of
was
cultures.
something that
We as
existed
a
within the
culture find
Soviet
the Romans
Empire.
particularly
Homophobia
fascinating
existed in
because on
China,
surface reading,
America,
they look
the
a lot
Protestant
like
ethic
us.
under
We
capitalism.
know more about them than we do any other culture in the West before the advent of the printing press, so we can get a much more in-depth understanding of who they were. That means we can see ourselves in them much more than we can, say, the Etruscans or the Villanovan culture or the corded ware culture. But along with that, I think, comes a glance at our own mortality as a culture.
Mhm.
If an insignificant little town in Italy can rise to become the dominant culture in the region and then collapse, what does that say about our own culture? I think everyone has a sense that the
Everything
foundation
dies.
upon which we've built
There's a
modern
sense
Western
of
culture
decay.
is
and
deeply
by
unstable.
scapegoating
Intelligent people have been
something
citing
through state
every
realism,
single alarm
through
they could find for
Roman
decades
realism, through
about our
capitalist
destruction of the
realism,
environment,
you can
our
cheat
lack of
death.
preparedness for major health
It's the
crises,
Skeksis from the
the
Dark
erosion of
Crystal.
democratic institutions, our over-reliance on fossil fuels and our stubborn unwillingness to move away from them, our willingness to put up with massive
The modern
economic
Prometheus,
inequality
as
that
Shelley would put it.
the list goes on. When we look at the fall of Rome, we see the fall of a once great civilization and wonder if we ourselves
I am
are living
Ozymandias,
similar
King of
fate. At
Kings.
the
Look at
same
my
time,
works,
I
ye
think most
mighty
of us
anticipate.
recognize that it doesn't have to be this way. Life doesn't have to be so bloody hard. We weren't put on this planet just to toil in meaningless jobs we hate, all to make just a few guys a little bit richer and then die. So when we look back to the Roman Empire, which looks a whole lot like the empire of global capital in some ways, some of us may hope to find a way to avoid a similar fate. But there's a danger in that. Learning from the past is important. Obviously, I believe that. But at the same time, it's easy to let the past simply confirm your biases. If you think the West is falling because of moral decay, you'll find Roman writers who confirm that for you. And if you think trans people are a sign of moral decay,
Confirmation
that then leads
bias.
you to the conclusion that trans people caused the fall of Rome. But that's nonsense. I think conservatism has also always been drawn to the
We don't
idea
have
of
that much
finding moral
power.
excuses for
You know,
social
it's like
woes. That's
blaming the
absolutely true in
witch
my
for having
age.
power over
The
the witch
right wing
hunter,
blames trans
who has
people for just
power in
about
that situation
every cultural
ultimately.
woe in the
Well,
same way they
I mean,
blamed tornadoes on gay marriage.
for the ability to
This is
influence
nonsensical
and
magical
reverse
thinking,
the
of course,
objection
but if you're
process, the
looking
witch
for
does have
simplistic
power.
answers
But just in
offered
terms of
by
just raw
charlatans who want to
unequal
take advantage
advantage,
of you,
power
you'll
imbalance
find it. So
from
did trans people
a
cause the
material
fall
and
of Rome?
social
No,
sort of capital,
we didn't.
the
In
witch
my work
hunter
putting this video
has the
together,
power
I didn't find anything
within
coming
society, within
anywhere
the status
near
quo.
a convincing argument in favor of that idea. So what did cause the fall
And that's
of
what
Rome?
we have to
A
operate
lot
within as
of
trans
things.
people.
I knew I
We're a
wasn't going to
minority
find
that's
the
being persecuted
cause
and blamed
for
for
the fall of Rome
something
in
that
researching
we
this
couldn't
video
have
because
possibly have caused
thousands of years of scholarship by minds
then or
much more
now.
devoted to the subject than I has yet to find it. But what I found particularly interesting is that social inequality and climate change seem to be significant driving factors. So if we're looking to the past to learn more about how to avoid a similar fate to that of the Romans, maybe we ought to address those. But regardless of what led to its fall, or if it even ever fell in the first place, we're still here. Because as much as we must contribute to the culture in which we live, that culture exists purely to benefit the people within it. Otherwise, what's the point of culture? Why are we doing any of this? But even if the Roman Empire fell, many of the people who created that culture survived and passed down their own cultural experiences. That includes trans people. From the early days of the Roman Republic to the twilight of the empire, we find evidence of trans people. Christians persecuted pagan worship practices, including those of the Galli, but that wasn't enough to erase us. The collapse of a centralized Roman state wasn't enough to erase us. The instability of the medieval era
Trans
wasn't
people tend to
enough
operate
erase
from a
us.
certain
You
degree
and I
of
are a
secrecy.
testament to
We
that.
walk
My
among
friends,
you.
we are part of a glorious tradition of gender nonconformity stretching throughout the ages. From the dawn of history to the present day, we find people who look like us. We're present during the fall of
There's
empires,
always a
but we're also
Phantom
present
of the
during their
Opera,
rise.
right? A
We're
ghost.
a part of the human story, just like anybody else. Because we have always existed. And so long as humanity continues to endure,
So
too
shall we?
shall we.
Yeah. The idea of the past is something to learn from. I see it, the wisdom of the ancients vis-a-vis the Gothic and its tendency to fabricate things in ways useful to the liberation of workers. Sex work is my focus, but any worker ultimately. Trans people are often sex workers, but not always. And we're generally sharing the same stage or space as bad actors like what's her face, Camille Paglia, and turning to the past in a nostalgic way where your idea of the past is under attack in ways where I would argue that, like, I tend to view people like her as up to no good. So, like, I don't tend to treat them as just neutral actors. They're someone who's basically exploiting us, and regardless of why they're doing it in ways that are deeply dishonest and at times self-deceiving, even. And no matter how hard they try, we will still survive. It's not possible to eradicate trans people because we exist in a position that it's not tied to a national body. And you're talking about gender nonconformity that really extends to just about the entire species. It's not so easily divided into a simple binary. If a binary didn't exist back in the day, despite the nuclear model, it sure as hell doesn't exist now. Let's see if there's an outro here.
Hey, thanks for watching. This video really got away from me, but I hope I still got the point across. This is the last React type video I'm going to be planning for quite a long time. So from here, we're going to get back to doing proper history subjects. If you like this video, do all the algorithm stuff at the bottom.
I think I was able to
Please,
follow
please.
along. Honestly,
And
I
special
was
thanks to these awesome people who make this channel more
I found
sustainable.
myself struggling to remember a lot of the there was just so much history stuff. And like some of it I sort of came into the video knowing like the fall of Rome. Okay, I was familiar with Rome dividing into the West and the East, and the Byzantines calling themselves Romans and the Russians czars, and that kind of thing. So there was some stuff that I was familiar with. It was really interesting though, learning about the stuff that, I'm familiar with people like Camille Paglia, though again, usually I work up against TERFs who kind of are of the second generation. So finding someone who's a TERF who's like even more old school and reactionary than something like J.K. Rowling, or a different flavor of reactionary was interesting. And the way that they basically completely ignore a lot of the history that you're bringing up. I really enjoyed, who was it? Sylvanus. That was cool. Where I was like, oh, uh, is this like a Roman record or is this Marx? There was a critiquing the rich, the class critique. I really, really liked that kind of stuff. The part where I kind of felt like I was going cross-eyed was basically just the stuff with Camille, and basically you have to set up all of this history and then just show her ignoring all of that and explaining like what she's doing while ignoring it and what she hopes to achieve, and also acknowledging trans people's place within that. I was kind of expecting a little bit more close analysis just of her and some of her stuff. I guess I tend to get really down in the weeds by examining TERFs and just all the stupid shit that they say. But I found that you were focusing more on the stuff that she was ignoring, which I liked. It was very educational because I felt like I get a chance to actually learn about history as something that she's ignoring, and learning about historians who could be transphobic, but not always. There were a lot of potential allies in the ancient world. And you're definitely very well equipped to talk about that kind of stuff. So yeah, no, that was really cool. I liked it. Um it's it was thought provoking insofar as the actual history, and it was a unique aspect of bigoted feminism that attacks trans people that I'm not used to examining. I wasn't familiar with this person or the person who was interviewing them, and I could kind of approach them and see what they were talking about in relation to the TERFs that I normally critique. But it still felt a bit different just because they're like the feminists who, again, that Pygmalion syndrome that's taken to like its logical conclusion, where they're basically like basking in like antiquity as something to view in this very openly fascist kind of way. Whereas J.K. Rowling is kind of stuck in Gothic pastiche out of second wave feminism, which is sort of its own thing. So yeah, no, it was super interesting. It's just an aspect of it that I hadn't seen before, alongside a lot of ancient history, trans or otherwise, that some of it I could relate to, but a lot of it was new. And so if I was quiet in parts of this video, it's just because I was processing everything that you were saying. I loved all the block quotes, the voices, and stuff like that. Reminds me of Monty Python. Use the funny voice. So yeah, no, it was cool. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for making the video, and I hope that this is largely just something that I made for Sophie. But if other people watch this as well, or if Sophie is okay with me sharing this with a larger audience, I will. But otherwise, this is just largely for them. But if other people found my thoughts and my thought process as a gothicist interesting, as a trans anarcho-communist, like helpful, as a holistic sort of thing. Struggle is holistic. Intersectional problems require intersectional solutions. So I welcome learning this kind of stuff. Everyone should watch this video. It's very good. But yeah, in any event, I'm going to cap off the video there. I just wanted to give a little bit of extra feedback at the end. Thanks again, Sophie, for making this. I learned a lot. I feel like I didn't probably retain as much as I could have if I wasn't responding actively and trying to record, but I'll probably end up watching this again just so I can give you my full undivided attention. But yeah, thanks for making it. Thanks for watching my feedback. And until next time, take care. Stay safe out there.